Hey guys, tonight we are pulling back the heavy, probably lice-infested curtain of time to explore why your comfortable 21st century self might find historical living a tad challenging. Imagine yourself, right now, not nestled in your soft bed, but thrust into the gritty, unyielding reality of the past. Picture the flickering, uncertain light of a single hearth casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn wooden walls, the air thick with smells you can't quite identify, but instinctively know are not Febreze. Honestly, with your refined palate and aversion to, let's say, communal sleeping arrangements with farm animals, you probably wouldn't last a day in a Viking longhouse. It's just a hunch. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always lovely to know who's out there, listening in the quiet hours. Go ahead and post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far these little historical jaunts reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing before it, a structure that seems to have grown organically from the very earth itself. The Viking longhouse looms, long and low, its turf-covered roof blending almost seamlessly with the grey, overcast sky. It's late afternoon, you think, judging by the weak, watery sunlight that does little to warm the damp chill clinging to your clothes. Clothes that are already feeling woefully inadequate. A biting wind whips around you, carrying the scent of salt from a nearby fjord and something else. Something acrid and smoky. There are no manicured lawns here, no welcoming porch lights, just churned mud, a few hardy-looking, and frankly, quite intimidating, chickens pecking at unseen morsels, and the imposing, almost windowless facade of the longhouse. You tentatively push open the heavy wooden door, no doorbell, how quaint, and step into, well, it's certainly an experience. The transition is jarring. From the muted, damp light outside, you're plunged into a cavernous gloom, illuminated only by a long, central fire pit that crackles and spits, sending a column of smoke upwards towards a hole in the roof that seems far too small for the job. Your eyes sting almost immediately. The air is thick, a palpable entity you could almost chew, a heady cocktail of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, damp wool, cooking food. Is that fish? Or just very old socks? And something vaguely animalistic. It's like a really committed barbecue, but you're the brisket. You take a hesitant step forward, your feet sinking slightly into the uneven earthen floor. Mind your step, that's not just mud, it's character. Yeah, let's call it character. As your eyes slowly adjust to the Stygian dimness, shapes begin to resolve themselves. Rough wooden benches line the long walls, covered in furs and woven textiles of indeterminate cleanliness. Down the centre, the fire pit, or langeld, is the heart of this space, the source of the light, heat, and a truly astonishing amount of smoke. Viking longhouses, as you might recall from a half-forgotten history documentary, were the central hub of Norse life. Typically long, narrow buildings that could stretch anywhere from 5 to an impressive 75 metres, housing not just one nuclear family, but an entire extended clan, retainers, and sometimes, in a section at one end, their precious livestock. Historians still argue whether the livestock were always kept in a distinct, partitioned area, or if, in some poorer households, the separation was less defined, leading to an even more aromatic living situation. Given the general olfactory assault you're currently experiencing, you're leaning towards the less defined theory for this particular establishment. You can hear voices now, guttural and unfamiliar, echoing slightly in the vast space. Figures move in the periphery, large and swathed in practical drab-coloured wool and leather. No one seems to pay you much mind, which is perhaps a blessing. You spot what look like tools leaning against the wall, axes, spears, shields. Not exactly your typical household decor. The air is cold despite the fire. The walls are likely wattle and daub or timber, and while the turf roof provides good insulation, drafts seem to sneak in from every conceivable crevice. Your modern sensibilities are screaming for a thermostat, a window you can actually open without inviting a blizzard, and perhaps an air purifier, or 10. A quirky detail you notice near the entrance, almost trodden into the mud, is a small carved piece of bone, perhaps an animal vertebrae. You vaguely remember reading about Dirabane animal bone amulets sometimes found at thresholds, possibly for protection, or luck. Or maybe someone just dropped their lunch. It's hard to tell in this light. What is clear is that this isn't a museum exhibit. This is life, raw and unfiltered. The smells aren't curated, the floor isn't roped off, and the faint rhythmic thumping you can hear from the far end of the longhouse isn't a sound effect. It's probably someone engaged in a monotonous, back-breaking chore that has to be done, day in and day out, just to keep this whole operation from collapsing. You wonder, with a growing sense of unease, what your chore will be. Surely they won't just let you stand here, a bewildered interloper in your suspiciously clean, for now, clothes, gawking at their historically accurate way of life. The ordeal you were promised is just beginning to dawn on you, and it smells faintly of fermented fish and existential dread. You haven't even tried to find a place to sit yet, let alone sleep. And the bathroom situation? Let's not even go there right now. Your survival instincts are already pinging, not for danger from a wild beast or a marauding enemy, but from the sheer, overwhelming otherness of it all. You're still rooted to the spot just inside the doorway, feeling like a poorly disguised alien dropped into a historical reenactment, where everyone else got the memo about the dress code and the required level of stoicism. The initial shock of the smoke and the unique aroma is beginning to give way to a more nuanced appreciation of your surroundings, and by nuanced appreciation, you mean a growing catalogue of things that are making your skin crawl. Let's start with what you can see, or rather what you can't quite see. The single long fire pit casts a dramatic, almost theatrical light upwards, illuminating the underside of the sooty roof beams far above, but leaving much of the rest of the vast space in deep shadow. It's like being in a particularly gloomy amateur theatre production, and you've forgotten your lines. Figures drift in and out of these shadowed areas, their faces momentarily lit by the fire's glow, then receding back into the gloom. It's disconcerting trying to track movement when half the room is a shifting tapestry of black and deep brown. You spot rough-hewn wooden pillars, massive tree trunks really, supporting the ridgepole. The walls, where you can make them out, are not smooth or plastered. They're a patchwork of timber, daub, and what looks suspiciously like dried animal dung in places. An excellent insulator, no doubt, and probably contributed to that special something in the air. Historians generally agree that most longhouses were constructed with timber frames, often with wattle and daub infill or clad with wooden planks, and those distinctive turf roofs. The quality and specific materials, of course, varied greatly depending on wealth and location. This one feels robustly rustic. The floor, as you've already established, is mostly compacted earth. Here and there you can see flatter stones placed, perhaps to create a slightly more stable surface, or maybe just where someone dropped a heavy rock and couldn't be bothered to move it. Litter is, well, it's not a feature. Scraps of leather, discarded bits of food, you try not to look too closely, wood shavings and unidentifiable bits of stuff are scattered about. It's not that they're deliberately messy, it's more that the concept of a pristine, clutter-free living space hasn't quite caught on yet. Or maybe the room got lost in the Bronze Age. Now, let's talk about the sounds. The crackle and pop of the central fire is a constant, a sort of baseline rhythm to the longhouse. Layered over this are the human sounds, the murmur of conversation in that old Norse tongue that sounds impressively stern even when they're probably just discussing the weather. A cough, deep and chesty from a shadowed corner, the occasional grunt or sigh. Then there are the animal noises. You're pretty sure you heard a goat bleat from what you hope is the far partitioned end of the longhouse. Chickens cluck and scratch somewhere nearby, possibly under a bench. And is that a baby crying? Or a very unhappy cat? It's hard to distinguish. The acoustics are surprisingly good, or perhaps just surprisingly echoey, turning the whole space into a resonant chamber of unfamiliar noises. It's like a white noise machine gone rogue, playing sounds of impending medieval discomfort. And the textures. Oh, the textures. You haven't touched much yet, thankfully, but your eyes are doing a pretty good job of imagining it for you. The wooden benches look splintery. The furs thrown over them look lived in, deeply lived in, like generations of Vikings have shed, slept, and possibly spilled mead on them. You run a hesitant finger along the rough wooden doorframe you just passed through. It's not sanded smooth, it's still got the character of the tree it came from, plus a fine layer of grime. You imagine leaning against one of the walls and feeling the cold, damp, slightly crumbly surface. The very air feels textured, heavy with moisture and particulate matter. You can almost feel the smoke particles settling on your skin, in your hair. You're developing a sudden, desperate craving for a wet wipe. A very, very large wet wipe. A quirky little detail catches your eye. Tucked into a crevice between two wall timbers, you spot a small, intricately carved wooden bird no bigger than your thumb. It's worn smooth with age or handling. Was it a child's toy? A good luck charm? Or just something whittled to pass the time, during the long, dark winters? Such small, personal items are occasionally found in archaeological digs of longhouse sites, offering tiny glimpses into the individual lives within these communal dwellings. It's a small reminder that amidst the apparent roughness, there was artistry and personal sentiment. One of the ongoing scholarly debates revolves around the precise internal layout and division of space within longhouses. While the general idea of a central hearth and benches along the sides is well established, the specifics of how different areas were used, for sleeping, crafting, storage or socialising, can be less clear. Were there invisible lines dictating who sat where? How strictly were animal quarters separated, especially in less affluent homes? The evidence is often open to interpretation. You look around, trying to decipher the unspoken rules of this particular space. There's a loom against one wall, suggesting a crafting area. Piles of what look like dried fish near another section might indicate food storage. It's a multi-purpose living space taken to the extreme. You instinctively hug yourself, trying to conserve body heat. The chill seems to seep up from the earthen floor. The fire, while impressive, doesn't seem to do much to warm the periphery of the room. You're starting to understand why Vikings were so fond of wool and furs. It wasn't a fashion statement, it was a survival necessity. You also understand why they were so keen on raiding warmer climes. Probably just wanted to sit somewhere without their teeth chattering. A large figure detaches itself from the shadows near the fire and lumbers towards you. For a heart-stopping moment you think you've been spotted, your otherworldly cleanliness a dead giveaway. But the figure, a burly man with a magnificent beard that looks like it could house a family of small birds, merely grunts as he passes you, heading for the door. He gives you a cursory glance, his eyes lingering for a second on your, by comparison, pristine clothes, and then he's gone, out into the fading light. You exhale, a little shaky. The sensory assault is relentless. It's not just one thing, it's the cumulative effect of the smoke, the smells, the dimness, the unfamiliar sounds, the pervasive chill, and the underlying sense of, well, dirt. It's an environment that's actively hostile to your modern, sanitized sensibilities. You haven't even tried to find a place to sleep yet, and already you're wondering if there's an early checkout option. Alright, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the pervasive, all-encompassing smell that has been your constant companion since you stepped over that threshold. It's not just a smell, it's a rich tapestry of aromas, a veritable symphony of stink that your 21st century nose is finding particularly challenging. The most dominant note, of course, is the smoke. It's not the pleasant, nostalgic scent of a distant bonfire or a cosy fireplace. This is thick, acrid, and eye-wateringly pungent. The central fire pit, the langeld, is burning wood, yes, but probably also peat, dried dung, and whatever other combustible materials they could get their hands on. Remember that hole in the roof? The alleyways? It's meant to be a chimney, but it's fighting a losing battle. Much of the smoke seems to prefer lingering, swirling through the rafters, coating every surface with a fine layer of soot and pickling the lungs of everyone inside. You can feel it in your throat, a scratchy irritation that makes you want to cough constantly. Your eyes are definitely watering. It's like being permanently downwind of a poorly managed bonfire. This constant smoke was a fact of life. While it did help to preserve the timbers of the roof, and likely kept some insects at bay, a sort of accidental fumigation, it also had significant health implications. Respiratory problems must have been rampant. You can almost hear the chorus of hacking coughs that would have been the soundtrack to a Viking winter. Imagine trying to recover from a simple cold in this atmosphere. No vapor-rub, no soothing lozenges, just more smoke. Historians widely acknowledge the health impacts of such poorly ventilated living conditions. Evidence of lung damage is often found in skeletal remains from the period. It makes you appreciate your extractor fan in a whole new way. Beneath the dominant note of smoke, there are other, more subtle, and arguably more unsettling scents. There's the smell of unwashed bodies. Regular hot water bathing with soap wasn't exactly a daily ritual. While Vikings were actually known to be cleaner than many of their European contemporaries, they reportedly bathed weekly, a shocking display of hygiene to some. Clean is a relative term. In a crowded longhouse with people working, sweating and sleeping in close proximity, the collective human aroma would have been significant. Add to that the scent of damp wool and leather clothing, which rarely, if ever, got a thorough wash and dry cycle. Think wet dog, but make it Viking. Then there's the food. Something is definitely cooking, or perhaps just slowly fermenting over by the fire. You catch whiffs of fish, oily and strong, and perhaps some kind of stew or porridge. Food preparation was a constant activity, and the smells of boiling, roasting, smoking and drying foods would have mingled with everything else. Remember, refrigeration is centuries away. Preservation methods like salting, smoking and drying were crucial, and these processes have their own distinctive odours. You might also be smelling the lingering scent of spilled ale or mead, which, while perhaps pleasant in moderation, could add a sour, yeasty note when soaked into an earthen floor. It's a veritable potpourri of ancient domesticity. And let's not forget the animals. Even if the livestock were notionally kept in a separate section, their presence would have been olfactorily obvious. The warm, earthy scent of cattle, sheep, or goats, along with the sharper ammonia tang of their waste, would inevitably permeate the entire structure, especially with shared ventilation, or lack thereof. You might catch a whiff of chicken droppings from those hardy birds pecking around. It's all part of the rich, organic tapestry. One quirky, though perhaps not entirely surprising tidbit, is that rushes and fragrant herbs were often strewn on the floor. This wasn't just for comfort, it was an attempt to mitigate the less pleasant smells and perhaps keep down the dust. Think of it as ancient Glade plugins, only significantly less effective and requiring a lot more sweeping. The very materials of the longhouse itself contribute to the aroma profile. The earthen floor, perpetually damp in places, would have its own musty smell. The timber framing, the wattle and daub walls, especially if incorporating that dung we mentioned, the turf roof, all these organic. Materials absorb and release odours, creating a complex layered scent that is uniquely longhouse. It's the smell of survival, of a close and constant relationship with the natural world, in all its fragrant and not so fragrant aspects. Historians still argue about the precise balance of these smells and how much they would have bothered the inhabitants. Were they simply acclimatized to it, their senses dulled by constant exposure, or was it a persistent low-level discomfort they simply endured? It's likely a bit of both. What's certain is that your modern nose, accustomed to filtered air and a plethora of deodorizing products, is having a very hard time. You find yourself taking shallow breaths, trying to filter the air through your teeth, a completely useless gesture that probably makes you look a bit deranged. You wonder if they ever tried to air the place out. Opening the main door and perhaps a smaller door at the other end, if one existed, might create a through draft, but it would also let out all the precious heat and invite in the cold, rain or snow. It was a constant trade-off, smoky warmth versus fresh frigidity. Given the harsh northern climates, warmth usually won. So the smoke, the smells, the general miasma, they were just part of the package. You're starting to think that fresh air might be your favourite modern invention. That, and perhaps antibacterial soap. You make a mental note to never again complain about the smell of your roommate's burnt toast. This is a whole other league of aromatic assault. You haven't even been here that long, and you already feel like your clothes, your hair, your very soul are becoming impregnated with the signature scent of Viking Longhouse. It's a souvenir you really, really don't want to take home. The day, such as it was in this smoky gloom, is clearly drawing to a close. The activity around the central fire pit seems to be winding down, the conversations becoming more subdued. People are starting to settle onto the long wooden benches that line the walls, the same benches that serve as seating during the day. This, you realise with a dawning sense of horror, is where you're supposed to sleep. Your Viking slumber party, as you'd sarcastically dubbed it in your head, is about to become a very real, very uncomfortable experience. Forget memory foam mattresses and high thread count sheets. The sleeping arrangements here are, to put it mildly, communal and basic. The benches are wide enough to lie on, perhaps 2 to 3 feet across, and run the length of the main living area on either side of the fire. Some are bare wood, others are strewn with animal furs, reindeer, sheep, possibly wolf, of varying degrees of cleanliness and repair. You see some lumpy-looking bundles that might be straw-filled sacks, serving as primitive mattresses or pillows. Privacy is clearly not a concept that has much currency here. You'll be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with your new Viking housemates, a charming assortment of snoring, coughing, and possibly flatulent individuals. It's like a music festival camping trip, but without the music, the wellies, or the option to retreat to your own tent when it all gets too much. You tentatively approach an unoccupied stretch of bench. It looks hard and lumpy and suspiciously stained in places. You eye the furs with deep suspicion. While they undoubtedly offer some warmth, they also look like prime real estate for fleas, lice, and other uninvited bedfellows. Remember those stories about how Vikings were surprisingly clean? Well, surprisingly clean for the 9th century still leaves a lot of room for tiny, unwelcome guests. You instinctively scratch your arm. It's probably just psychosomatic. For now. A mainstream historical fact about longhouse sleeping is that families would often sleep together in designated sections of the benches, sometimes with wooden partitions or chests separating different family groups, though these were likely more common in the halls of wealthier chieftains. For most, it was a more jumbled affair, especially if guests or retainers were present. Status might dictate who got the better spots, perhaps closer to the fire for warmth, or further from the door to avoid drafts. As a newcomer of uncertain status and questionable Viking hardiness, you'll probably get whatever spot is left over, likely the one with the biggest draft and the lumpiest fur. You sit down gingerly on the edge of the bench. The wood is cold and unforgiving beneath you. You try to arrange a rather mangy-looking sheepskin into something resembling a cushion. It smells faintly of lanolin and wet sheep. A large bearded Viking settles down next to you with a grunt, taking up a significant amount of space and radiating an aura of wood smoke and something you really hope is just old sweat. He doesn't even glance at you. Personal space is clearly another modern luxury you've left behind. You wonder if there's an etiquette to this. Do you say goodnight? Offer to share your non-existent blanket? Or just try to become as small and unnoticeable as possible? You opt for the latter. As more people settle down, the sounds of the longhouse begin to change. The crackling fire is still there, but now it's accompanied by a symphony of human settling noises, rustling furs, sighs, coughs, so many coughs, and the beginnings of what promises to be a truly epic chorus of snoring. One particularly enthusiastic individual, a few bodies down, sounds like a walrus gargling gravel. Another is producing a series of high-pitched whistles that could probably summon dogs from the next fjord. It's going to be a long night. You can already feel the fatigue setting in, but the prospect of actual sleep in these conditions seems remote. A quirky, or perhaps just deeply unsettling tidbit, is that in some sagas and archaeological finds, there's evidence of bed closets, or enclosed sleeping compartments built into the walls or as separate structures within the longhouse. These would have offered more privacy and warmth, but were likely reserved for the head of the household and their immediate family. For everyone else, it was the open-plan bench system. You glance around hopefully, but see no sign of such cosy nooks, just endless, uninviting bench. Historians still argue about how people dealt with the cold, especially in the depths of a Scandinavian winter. Did they sleep fully clothed? Did they huddle together for warmth, dispensing with any notion of personal space entirely? Were there designated bench warmers who had to get in first? Probably a combination of all these. The furs were essential, and sharing body heat was likely a common survival tactic. You shiver, despite the proximity of your new, rather pungent benchmate. The drafts seem to find every gap in your inadequate modern clothing. You wish you'd packed your thermal underwear, and maybe a biohazard suit. The light from the fire is dying down now, banked for the night to conserve fuel. The shadows deepen, and the vast space feels even larger and more mysterious. You can hear small skittering sounds from the darker corners. Mice? Rats? You try not to think about it. You lie down, pulling the scratchy sheepskin over you as best you can. It offers minimal comfort and maximum olfactory offence. The hardwood presses into your hip and shoulder. You try to find a comfortable position, but it's hopeless. Every slight shift brings you into contact with either the cold wall or your snoring neighbour. Sleep, when it finally, fitfully comes, is punctuated by strange dreams, the snores of your companions, the persistent coughs, and the ever-present smell of smoke and unwashed Viking. You jolt awake several times, once convinced a rat was using your hair as a climbing rope. It was probably just a stray piece of straw from the lumpy sack pillow. Another time, your benchmate rolls over, his arm flinging out and narrowly missing your face. You are acutely aware of every itch, every rustle, every unfamiliar sound. This isn't restful sleep, it's a state of hyper-vigilant discomfort. You wouldn't last a day. You're not sure you're going to last the night. And the sun, when it finally decides to make an appearance, feels like it's several geological epochs away. A grey, grudging light eventually begins to filter through the smoke hole, and any tiny chinks in the longhouse walls, signalling the start of another day you're not entirely sure you're equipped to handle. Your back aches, your neck is stiff, and you feel like you've slept on a pile of very aggressive rocks. The symphony of snores has mercifully subsided, replaced by coughs, groans, and the sounds of people stirring. And of course, that signature longhouse aroma is still there, perhaps even enhanced by the night's collective exhalations. But your most immediate concern, as your stomach rumbles a mournful protest, is breakfast. Or whatever the Viking equivalent is. You have a sinking feeling it won't involve artisanal sourdough toast and a perfectly brewed flat white. You watch as figures begin to move around the rekindled central fire. The morning routine seems to involve a lot of stretching, scratching, and spitting into the flames. Charming. Soon the smell of cooking, or at least food being heated, starts to mingle with the ever-present smoke. A large iron cauldron, black with soot, is already suspended over the fire, its contents bubbling away mysteriously. Someone ladles a portion of something into a rough wooden bowl and hands it to another Viking who begins to eat with gusto, using only a knife and his fingers. Your appetite, already suppressed by the general ambience, takes another nosedive. Viking cuisine, you recall, was heavily reliant on what could be farmed, hunted, fished, or foraged in the often harsh northern landscapes. Think hardy grains like barley and oats, root vegetables, dairy products, milk, cheese, skyr, a type of yogurt, and a lot of meat and fish. Preservation was key. So much of the animal protein would have been salted, dried, smoked, or fermented. Fresh fruit and a wide variety of vegetables would have been seasonal and less common than in more temperate climes. One of the staples was a kind of stew or porridge, often cooked in a single pot over the fire, to which ingredients were continually added. Yesterday's leftovers forming the base for today's meal? Probably. It's an efficient system, if not entirely appealing to your modern palate, which is currently screaming for a fruit smoothie and a side of anything not beige. You're eventually offered a bowl of the communal breakfast. It's a thick, greyish porridge, lumpy and steaming. You can't quite identify the ingredients. There might be some kind of grain, perhaps some bits of dried meat, and an overall flavour that's earthy and salty. Very, very salty. You take a tentative spoonful. It's not actively disgusting, but it's a long, long way from your morning bowl of Cheerios. It's sustenance, pure and simple, designed to fuel a hard day's work, not to delight the taste buds. You try to eat, mimicking the others who are scooping it up with hunks of heavy dark bread that looks like it could double as a doorstop. No delicate nibbling here, it's all about efficient calorie intake. A mainstream historical fact is that bread was indeed a part of the Viking diet, but it would have been very different from modern bread. Typically unleavened or made with whatever grains were available, resulting in dense, flat loaves. Sometimes, less conventional ingredients like tree bark or peas might be ground into flour during lean times. You eye the bread suspiciously. It looks like it might contain a significant amount of character-building fibre. For drinks, water would have been common, but also milk, buttermilk, and of course, ale and mead. The ale was likely a weak everyday brew consumed by everyone, including children, as it was often safer than water. Mead, made from fermented honey, was a more prized drink, often associated with feasts and celebrations. You're offered a horn, yes, an actual animal horn, of something that smells faintly of sour apples. It's probably the weak ale. You take a sip. It's watery, a bit tart, and not entirely unpleasant, though the horn itself has a certain gamey aroma. At least it might wash down the porridge. You try not to think too hard about how often the horn is washed, or by whom. A quirky, culinary tidbit. Vikings were known to consume seabirds and their eggs, sometimes raiding cliffs to gather them. Puffin, anyone? They also ate seal and whale meat when available, and let's not forget fermented shark, hakal, an Icelandic delicacy, though perhaps more post-Viking age, its roots are ancient, famous for its ammonia-rich smell and acquired taste. Thankfully, that doesn't seem to be on this morning's menu. Small mercies. Historians still argue about the diversity of the Viking diet and the extent to which it varied by social status and geographical location. Chieftains and wealthy farmers undoubtedly ate better and had access to a wider range of foods, including imported luxuries like wine or spices, than ordinary folk. Coastal communities would have relied more heavily on fish and marine mammals, while inland settlements focused more on farming and hunting. The porridge you're currently struggling with is likely standard fare for the average longhouse dweller. It's fuel, not fine dining. Forget farm to table. This is more like scrape it from the bottom of the pot and be grateful. You notice some individuals gnawing on what looks like dried fish, stiff as a board, or tearing off pieces of smoked meat. The smell is potent. This is survival food, packed with protein and preserved to last through long voyages or lean winters. You imagine the jaw strength required to get through some of it. Your teeth, accustomed to softer fare, ache in sympathy. You also see some rudimentary cheese, hard and yellow, being sliced with a knife. It probably has a kick like a mule. The concept of 3 distinct meals a day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, wasn't necessarily fixed. People likely ate when they were hungry and food was available, often 2 main meals, dagmal, day meal, in the morning, and nattmal, night meal, in the evening. What you're experiencing now is the dagmal. It's clear that a lot of time and effort went into food procurement and preparation. There are no supermarkets, no convenience foods. Every calorie has to be earned through hard labour. You suddenly feel a deep appreciation for your refrigerator, your microwave, and the sheer, unadulterated miracle of a takeaway pizza. You manage to get down about half of your porridge, mostly by telling yourself it's a cultural experience, a very chewy, very salty cultural experience. Your digestive system, however, is sending up warning flares. This is going to be an interesting day. Having bravely, or foolishly, navigated the culinary landscape of a Viking breakfast, your thoughts inevitably turn to another pressing matter of modern comfort: hygiene. After a night spent marinating in smoke, sweat, and the general effluvia of a crowded longhouse, and now having consumed a meal of questionable origin with unwashed hands, because where would you even begin to wash them properly? You feel a desperate, primal urge for a hot shower and a vigorous scrub with something that promises to kill 99.9% of germs. Alas, such luxuries are several centuries and a technological revolution away. Let's talk about Viking ablutions. As mentioned, Vikings were actually considered quite clean by the standards of their time. The sagas often mention washing and grooming. They even had tools for it. Combs, often made of bone or antler and quite elaborately decorated, tweezers, and even ear spoons for cleaning out earwax. A rather intimate detail preserved in archaeological finds, so they weren't wallowing in filth, relatively speaking. However, their concept of cleanliness and the available facilities were, shall we say, different from yours. You look around for anything resembling a bathroom or even a wash basin. You see none. Water would have been hauled from a nearby well, stream, or river. For a quick wash, you might get a basin of cold water and a piece of rough linen. Soap, as you know it, didn't really exist in the same form. They might have used lye-based concoctions, which could be quite harsh, or perhaps certain plants known for their cleansing properties. A mainstream historical fact is the Viking practice of a weekly bath, often on Saturdays, logadaga, meaning washing day, or bath day in Old Norse, which is still the word for Saturday in modern Scandinavian languages. This often involved a sauna-like experience in a dedicated bathhouse, if the settlement was large enough or the family wealthy enough to have one. Otherwise, it might be a dip in a cold river or lake, invigorating if not exactly spa-like. You haven't seen a bathhouse, and the nearby fjord looks distinctly uninviting for a morning plunge. So for daily freshening up, it would likely be a very cursory affair. You spot a Viking splashing some water on his face from a bucket near the door, then running his fingers through his beard. That seems to be the extent of it. No sink, no running water, no fluffy towels. You feel a layer of grime forming on your skin just thinking about it. And then there's the delicate question of waste disposal. Where does one, go? There are no ensuite facilities here, no porcelain thrones with convenient flushing mechanisms. Outhouses or latrine pits would have been located away from the main dwelling for obvious reasons. This would involve a chilly and possibly precarious trip outside in all weathers, day or night. Toilet paper, forget it. Moss, leaves, or a handful of straw were the likely substitutes. It's a humbling thought. You remember reading a quirky tidbit that in some more advanced Roman settlements they had communal latrines with running water, but that was a different empire and a different time. Here, in the rugged north, things are a bit more elemental. You make a mental note to drastically reduce your fluid intake. Dental hygiene is another area where your modern sensibilities might clash with Viking reality. While they didn't have sugary processed foods causing widespread decay, their diet could be tough on teeth. Remember that hard bread and dried meat. They did clean their teeth, likely using frayed twigs or pieces of cloth, and some skeletal remains show surprisingly good dental health, though wear and tear was common. Halitosis, however, given the diet of fermented foods, smoked fish, and probably a fair bit of garlic, which they did cultivate and use, might have been a common social hurdle, or perhaps everyone just smelled vaguely of pickled herring, so no one noticed. Historians still argue about the exact nature and prevalence of parasites in Viking communities. Given the close proximity to animals, the earthen floors, the food preservation methods, and the sanitation standards, it's highly probable that internal and external parasites, like worms, fleas, and lice, as you've already nervously intuited, were a constant feature of life. Those intricately carved combs weren't just for styling magnificent beards, they were essential for delousing. You resist the urge to scratch your scalp. Vigorously, you see a woman meticulously combing her long hair by the firelight. It's a slow, careful process. Personal grooming, even with limited tools, was clearly important. Appearance, hair, and beards were significant in Norse culture, often reflecting status and identity. So, while their methods might seem rudimentary to you, the intent was there. They weren't intentionally unkempt, but their environment and resources dictated a very different standard. You consider your own state. Your hair feels greasy and smells of smoke. Your clothes, once clean, now feel like they have absorbed the entire essence of the longhouse. Your hands feel grubby. You would give a considerable sum for a bar of soap and 5 minutes under a stream of hot water. The lack of basic hygiene, by your standards, is becoming a significant source of discomfort, almost as much as the smoke or the questionable food. It's not just about feeling clean, it's about feeling human in the way you're accustomed to. This constant low-level grubbiness is eroding your morale. You realise that the daily battle wasn't just against the elements or potential enemies. It was also against the pervasive dirt and the ever-present threat of disease that thrived in less than sanitary conditions. Resilience was key, and perhaps a slightly less sensitive nose than yours. You catch a glimpse of your reflection in a murky puddle by the doorway as you briefly step outside for a breath of marginally fresher air. You look dishevelled and slightly haunted. The Viking makeover is well underway, whether you like it or not, and it mostly involves acquiring a patina of authentic historical grime. Now that you've sort of eaten and definitely not bathed to your satisfaction, you might be hoping for a bit of downtime. Perhaps a chance to sit quietly and contemplate the profound differences between 9th century Norse life and your own. Maybe journal a little, if you'd brought a spill-proof historically inaccurate notebook. But no, the longhouse is already a hive of activity, and it quickly becomes apparent that there are no passengers here. Everyone has a role, a task, a purpose. Survival in this environment is a full-time job, a relentless cycle of chores that starts before dawn and ends long after dusk. Respite. That's a good one. You'll get your respite when you're too old to card wool or mend a fishing net, and even then, you'll probably be expected to tell stories or watch the toddlers. You're awkwardly trying to stay out of the way, a skill you're rapidly perfecting, when a stern-looking woman with forearms like ship's timbers thrusts a bundle of something that looks like matted sheep's wool into your hands and points towards a group of women working with spindles and looms. The message is clear. No idleness allowed. You, my friend, are about to contribute to the textile industry of the Viking Age. Or at least, try not to make too much of a mess of it. The sheer amount of physical labour required to keep a longhouse functioning is staggering. Let's start with the basics. Fire. That central hearth doesn't fuel itself. Wood needs to be chopped and hauled, peat needs to be cut and dried. This is heavy, back-breaking work, often done in harsh weather. Then there's water. Every drop for drinking, cooking and minimal washing has to be carried from its source, often a considerable distance. Think about your effortless tap water and spare a thought for the sore shoulders and calloused hands that were the price of hydration here. Food preparation, as you've glimpsed, is an ongoing epic. Grains need to be threshed, winnowed and ground into flour, usually with a hand quern, a rotary hand mill made of stone, which is incredibly labour-intensive. You try to picture yourself grinding enough flour for that heavy bread you saw earlier, and your arms ache preemptively. Vegetables need to be tended in, small garden plots, if the season allows, harvested and prepared. Animals need to be cared for, fed, watered, mucked out, another delightful task you hope to avoid. If there are cows, they need milking. The milk then needs to be processed into cheese, butter or skyr to preserve it. Fishing nets need to be made and mended, lines baited, boats maintained. Hunting, when successful, means butchering and preserving the meat. It's a constant interconnected web of tasks, and if one part fails, the whole system suffers. And then there's textile production, your current unwilling assignment. Wool, the primary material for clothing, blankets and sails, doesn't just magically appear as yarn. It has to be sheared from sheep, another fun wriggly job, cleaned, a smelly process involving stale urine or other alkaline solutions to remove grease, carded or combed to align the fibres, spun into yarn using a drop spindle or a simple spinning wheel, and then woven on a warp-weighted loom. This entire process is incredibly time-consuming and skill-intensive. A mainstream historical fact, it could take hundreds, even thousands, of hours of labour to produce enough woolen cloth for a single sail for a Viking longship. So, your fumbling attempts to tease apart tangled wool fibres are, in the grand scheme of things, a very minor contribution, but a contribution nonetheless. The women around you work with a practiced efficiency that makes your efforts look comically inept. Their hands are never still. Men's work typically involved farming, fishing, hunting, trading, raiding, of course, and crafts like woodworking, metalworking and boat building. But the lines weren't always rigidly drawn, especially in a household context. Everyone contributed to the collective survival. Children too had their chores from a young age, fetching and carrying, scaring birds from crops, helping with animal care, learning the skills they would need as adults. There was no childhood in the modern sense of extended carefree play. Play happened, of course, but it was intertwined with learning and contributing. A quirky tidbit about Viking-age chores. Soapstone was a valuable resource, quarried and carved into bowls, lamps and cooking pots. It was soft enough to work, but also heat-resistant. Imagine the labour involved in quarrying heavy blocks of this stone and then painstakingly shaping it with basic tools. Or consider the collection of lichen to make dyes for those textiles, another task requiring knowledge and patience. Every object in the longhouse, from the spoon you ate your porridge with to the cloak on your back, represented a significant investment of time and effort. There are no disposable goods here. Everything is made, mended and reused until it falls apart. Historians still argue about the precise division of labour between men and women and how much it varied across different Norse communities and social strata. While sagas and archaeological evidence provide clues, the day-to-day realities for ordinary people can be harder to reconstruct fully. Was women's work in textile production or food processing valued as highly as men's work in raiding or trading? Within the household, power dynamics certainly existed, but the interdependence was undeniable. You struggle with the wool, your fingers clumsy and unused to such tasks. The air is still smoky, your back still aches from the bench bed, and now your shoulders are starting to protest this new form of torture. There are no coffee breaks, no checking your phone for a distraction. Just the relentless rhythm of work dictated by daylight and necessity. You look at the weathered faces and capable hands around you. There's a stoicism, a resilience, born of a life where comfort is scarce and hard work is the only currency that matters. You're starting to understand that lasting a day isn't just about enduring the physical discomforts. It's about having the stamina, the skills, and the sheer grit to pull your weight in a world that demands constant toil. Your modern life, with its conveniences and leisure time, seems like an impossible dream from this vantage point. You haven't even made it to lunchtime, and you're already exhausted. And you suspect the tasks are only going to get more demanding. As you continue your rather pathetic attempts at wool carding, acutely aware of the efficient, almost rhythmic movements of the women around you, you start to notice more subtle interactions. A deferential nod given to a particular grey-bearded man who enters the longhouse, the way children scamper out of the path of a stern-looking woman who seems to command the area around the hearth, the casual authority with which one man directs others in mending a fishing net. It dawns on you that this isn't just a random collection of people sharing a smoky, oversized shed. It's a complex society in miniature, with its own hierarchy, rules, and unspoken codes of conduct. Navigating this social labyrinth, you suspect, is just as crucial for survival as knowing how to gut a fish or spin yarn. And you, with your 21st century notions of egalitarianism and personal space, are completely out of your depth. At the top of the longhouse pecking order, you'd typically find the chieftain or head of the household, who's Bondi or Bondi for a free farmer, along with his wife, who's Freya, who often held considerable authority within the domestic sphere. She would manage the stores, oversee the servants and slaves, if any, and control the production of food and textiles, hence the keys often found in female graves, symbolising their control over the household wealth. The man you saw receiving deferential nods, probably the husbandi, the stern woman by the fire, almost certainly the husfreya. You make a mental note to be particularly polite, or at least exceptionally unobtrusive in their presence. Below this power couple would be their extended family, children, siblings, elderly parents. Then came freeborn retainers, farmhands, and skilled artisans who might live with the family. And at the bottom of the social ladder were the thralls, or slaves. Slavery was a well-established institution in the Viking Age, with thralls acquired through raiding, trading, or born into servitude. They performed the most menial and laborious tasks and had few, if any, rights. A mainstream historical fact is that a significant portion of the population in some Viking Age settlements may have been enslaved. You glance around, wondering if any of the people here are thralls. It's not immediately obvious from their clothing or tasks, at least not to your untrained eye, but their demeanour might be more subdued, their movements more subservient. It's a sobering thought, this stark inequality woven into the fabric of daily life. Respect, honour and reputation were paramount in Norse society. Public perception and one's standing in the community were incredibly important. Insults could lead to feuds, and loyalty to one's kin and chieftain was expected. There was a complex system of gift-giving, oaths and obligations that bound individuals and families together. You realise that your modern, somewhat casual approach to social interactions might be dangerously misconstrued here. A poorly timed joke, an overly familiar gesture, or even unintentional disrespect could have serious consequences. Remember those axes and spears leaning against the wall? They weren't just for decoration. Disputes were often settled personally, and violence was an accepted, if not always welcome, part of life. Your usual sarcastic wit is probably best kept under wraps. One quirky aspect of Norse social structure was the concept of the Thing, a governing assembly where free men gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and make political decisions. These assemblies operated at local and regional levels. It was a form of early democracy, though participation was generally limited to property-owning free men. Still, it shows a society that valued order and collective decision-making, even amidst the raiding and feuding. You wonder if this longhouse community has its own mini-thing for resolving internal squabbles, like who gets the last piece of dried fish, or who has to sleep in the draftiest spot, position you seem to have secured by default. Historians still argue about the degree of social mobility in Viking society. Was it possible for a thrall to gain freedom? Could a person of humble birth rise to prominence through skill or bravery? There are instances in the sagas suggesting such possibilities, but it was likely very difficult. For the most part, you were born into your social station, and that largely dictated the course of your life. Your own ambiguous status as a strange, unskilled visitor probably places you somewhere near the bottom, just above. Suspicious outsider who might be a spy for a rival clan. You decide that keeping a low profile and demonstrating a willingness to at least try to be useful, even if your wool carding skills are laughable, is your best strategy. You observe the interactions. A young boy proudly presents a small, freshly caught fish to the husbandi, who claps him on the shoulder with a gruff word of approval. Two men share a drinking horn, a common gesture of fellowship. A woman quietly admonishes a child who's getting too close to the fire. These are the small, everyday moments that build and reinforce the social fabric. There are also moments of tension, a sharp exchange between two younger men, quickly smoothed over by an older woman, a lingering, appraising look from one Viking to another that hints at an unspoken rivalry. The concept of hospitality, gestrisni, was also deeply ingrained. Travellers were generally offered food and shelter, as refusing hospitality could bring dishonour. This might explain why you haven't been immediately thrown out. However, guests were also expected to behave respectfully and not overstay their welcome. You are, in essence, a guest here, albeit an uninvited and rather useless one. The longer you stay, the more you'll be expected to contribute and integrate, or risk wearing out that welcome. You realise that your survival here isn't just about enduring the physical hardships. It's about understanding and conforming to a complex set of social expectations. It's about knowing who to defer to, who to be wary of, and how to conduct yourself without causing offence or appearing weak. Your modern assumptions about personal autonomy and direct communication are ill-suited to this world. Here, subtlety, observation, and a keen understanding of hierarchy are your best tools for social navigation. And you're learning on the job in a very smoky, very smelly classroom where the final exam might involve an actual axe. Suddenly that lumpy porridge seems like the least of your worries, just as you're starting to vaguely get a handle on who might be who in the smoky hierarchy of the longhouse, and your fingers are developing a sort of numb muscle memory for separating wool fibres badly. The scene around you shimmers and dissolves. The damp chill, the smell of wood smoke and unwashed Viking, the rough textures of wool and timber, they all fade, replaced by a blinding baking heat and the scent of hot sand and something else. Something dry and dusty with a faint sweetish undertone like dried papyrus. Your eyes, accustomed to the gloom, squint painfully against the brilliant, unrelenting sunlight. Gone are the turf roof and wooden walls. You're now standing under an azure sky, so vast and cloudless it feels infinite, and the ground beneath your feet is no longer cool earth, but hot, sun-baked mud brick. Welcome, you deduce with a growing sense of historical whiplash, to ancient Egypt. Your ordeal is apparently taking a detour to warmer, though not necessarily more comfortable climes. You're on a narrow, dusty pathway, flanked by low, flat-roofed dwellings made of sun-dried mud bricks. The heat is a physical presence pressing down on you, sucking the moisture from your skin. Your Viking-era woolen attire, which was merely inadequate in the longhouse, is now actively trying to cook you. Sweat prickles instantly all over your body. You thought the longhouse was a sensory assault. This is just a different kind of overwhelming. Instead of smoke, it's dust. Fine, pervasive dust that seems to get into your eyes, your nose, your mouth with every breath. Instead of the smell of damp and old fish, it's the smell of sun-baked earth, donkey dung, and perhaps a hint of a fragrant oil from a nearby dwelling. The daily grind in ancient Egypt, for the vast majority of the population, the farmers, labourers and artisans who formed the backbone of society, was incredibly arduous, dictated by the rhythms of the Nile and the demands of the state and the temples. Forget any romantic notions of lounging by palm-fringed oases, being fanned by servants. Life for the average Egyptian was one of hard, repetitive labour under a scorching sun. You see figures in the distance toiling in green fields that border a wide, glittering river, the Nile, undoubtedly. They are bent over, engaged in the back-breaking tasks of ploughing, sowing or irrigating, their skin burnished dark by the sun. Their clothing is simple, short linen kilts for the men, simple sheath dresses for the women, practical, but offering little protection from the relentless solar radiation. A mainstream historical fact, agriculture was the absolute foundation of the Egyptian economy and society, entirely dependent on the annual inundation of the Nile, which deposited fertile black silt, Kemet, the black land, as they called their country, that made farming possible in an otherwise desert environment. The agricultural calendar, with its seasons of flood, planting and harvest, governed everyone's lives. Failure of the inundation meant famine. So the work in the fields was not just a job, It was a matter of life and death for the entire civilization. You can almost feel the weight of that responsibility in the tired slump of the distant workers' shoulders. You think back to the Viking longhouse, cold, damp, smoky, yes. But this oppressive, radiating heat presents its own unique set of challenges. Dehydration would have been a constant threat, sunstroke, a daily hazard. And then there were the pests. The Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, also bred swarms of insects. Flies would have been everywhere. Mosquitoes, carrying diseases like malaria, which historians believe was endemic in ancient Egypt, would have been a torment, especially near the canals and irrigated fields. You swat at a persistent fly buzzing near your face. It's already started. And speaking of health, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen you might have vaguely heard about? While Egyptians were renowned for their medical knowledge, for the time, some of their remedies were creative. A quirky tidbit. Some medical papyri do indeed list animal dung as an ingredient in certain treatments, though perhaps not specifically as a mainstream sunscreen. They did use various oils and unguents to protect their skin from the dry heat and sun, and kohl eyeliner wasn't just cosmetic. It was believed to help deflect glare and deter flies. You could certainly use some of that kohl right now, as your eyes are streaming from the brightness. Historians still argue about the exact daily caloric intake and nutritional status of the average Egyptian peasant. While the land was fertile, much of the produce went to the state, the temples, and the elite. The diet of the common people consisted mainly of bread. Emmer wheat and barley were staples, beer, also made from barley, and a primary source of calories and hydration, onions, garlic, lentils, and fish from the Nile. Meat was more of a luxury. It was a relatively monotonous, though likely sufficient diet when harvests were good. You recall the bland Viking porridge with a strange, fleeting sense of nostalgia. At least it wasn't actively dusty. You see a group of men nearby, stripped to the waist, laboriously hauling massive blocks of stone towards a distant construction project. Perhaps a temple, or a tomb for some high-ranking official. Their muscles strain, their bodies gleam with sweat and dust. The sheer physical exertion is palpable. There are no power tools, no hydraulic lifts, just human muscle, levers, rollers, and an incredible amount of organised effort. This was the labour that built the pyramids, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the vast infrastructure of a civilization that lasted for millennia. And it was built on the backs of people like these, toiling day in, day out in conditions that would make your average modern construction worker demand hazard pay and a very long siesta. The path you're on is bustling. People pass by, some carrying baskets of produce, others leading laden donkeys. The sounds are different here. The braying of donkeys, the calls of vendors, if this were a more urban area, the chatter in a language that sounds nothing like old. Norse, full of softer consonants and different cadences. Children, dusty and energetic, dart in and out, seemingly oblivious to the heat. You are an anomaly here, just as you were in the Longhouse. Your Viking clothes are drawing curious, perhaps wary glances. You're too pale, too heavily dressed, too obviously out of place. The discomfort is different, but no less profound. The relentless sun, the choking dust, the sheer, grinding effort visible all around you. It's another facet of historical reality that your comfortable life has insulated you from. You're beginning to suspect that lasting a day is a recurring theme in this historical journey, and each new setting finds new ways to test your very modern limits. You desperately seek some shade, any shade at all, but the low sun-baked buildings offer little respite. The Egyptian daily grind has you firmly in its hot, dusty embrace. Having been unceremoniously dumped from the smoky confines of the Viking longhouse into the glaring heat of ancient Egypt, you find yourself gravitating towards the dubious shelter of one of those low, mud-brick dwellings. The sun is still beating down with an intensity that makes the air shimmer above the dusty ground, and the thought of escaping its direct gaze, even for a moment, is overwhelmingly appealing. You approach a narrow, uninviting doorway, a dark rectangle in the sun-bleached wall, and peer inside. Your Egyptian home, not so sweet home experience is about to begin. The interior is dim, a welcome relief after the blinding glare outside, but it's also incredibly cramped and stuffy. The air is thick with the smell of stale cooking fires. Different from the Viking wood smoke, this is more acrid, perhaps from burning animal dung or reeds. Unwashed bodies, a universal historical aroma it seems, and a certain earthy, slightly sweet smell you can't quite place. Maybe from the mud bricks themselves, or perhaps from stored grain. It's not as overwhelmingly smoky as the longhouse, as most cooking would have been done outdoors in a courtyard or on the flat roof to avoid turning the small interior into an oven. But the lack of ventilation creates its own oppressive atmosphere. The typical ancient Egyptian home for a commoner was a small, simple affair, usually consisting of a few rooms built around a central courtyard, or in more congested urban areas, multi-storey apartment-like structures. Walls were made of sun-dried mud bricks, cheap and readily available, and roofs were flat, made of palm logs covered with reeds and mud. These flat roofs were valuable extra living space, used for sleeping on hot nights, drying food, or catching any available breeze. You look up. The ceiling here is low, made of those palm logs you read about, and you can see bits of dried vegetation poking through. You hope it's structurally sound, and that nothing lives up there. The floor is compacted earth, much like the longhouse, though perhaps drier and dustier. There's very little furniture. Maybe a few low stools, some reed mats for sleeping, and some pottery jars for storing water, grain and beer. A small raised hearth in one corner suggests some indoor cooking might happen, perhaps in cooler weather. Possessions were minimal, some basic pottery, a few tools, perhaps a wooden chest for storing clothes or other small items. It's a life stripped down to essentials. No room for clutter or for much privacy either, if a whole family is living in this small space. You think of your own home, filled with books, gadgets, comfortable furniture, and so much stuff. The contrast is stark. A mainstream historical fact. Despite the simplicity of their homes, ancient Egyptians valued cleanliness and order. Ma'at, the concept of order, truth and justice, was central to their worldview. Homes would have been swept regularly, and personal hygiene, as much as conditions allowed, was important. However, clean is always relative to the environment. In a world of dust, mud, and rudimentary sanitation, keeping a home pristine by modern standards would have been an impossible task. And then there are the pests. Oh, the pests. If the longhouse had its potential for fleas and lice, the ancient Egyptian home had those and more, in abundance. The heat, the stored food, the nearby Nile with its teeming insect life. It was a paradise for vermin. Flies, as you've already experienced, would have been a constant nuisance. Mosquitoes, especially at dusk and dawn, would have made life miserable and spread disease. Then there were the less visible, but no less present inhabitants. Cockroaches scuttling in the shadows, ants marching in relentless columns towards any crumb of food, mice and rats gnawing their way into stored grain. And let's not forget scorpions and snakes, a genuine danger, especially in rural dwellings or those with poorly maintained walls or floors. You find yourself instinctively checking the dark corners and peering under the reed mats. You're not a fan of scorpions, or snakes, or anything with more than 4 legs, frankly. A quirky and rather unpleasant tidbit. Bedbugs were also likely companions in ancient Egyptian sleeping arrangements. Archaeologists have found evidence of these persistent pests in ancient sites. So, those reed mats on the floor, not just uncomfortable, but potentially teeming. You suddenly miss the scratchy, flea-ridden Viking furs. At least with furs you sort of knew what you were getting. Reed mats feel more insidiously infested. Historians still argue about the exact population density in urban areas like Thebes or Memphis. Some reconstructions suggest incredibly crowded conditions, with multi-storey tenements packed tightly together, narrow alleyways, and limited access to fresh water or sanitation. Disease would have spread rapidly in such environments. Even in more rural village settings, families lived in close proximity, sharing resources and inevitably germs. The infant mortality rate was tragically high, and life expectancy, while difficult to pinpoint accurately for commoners, was significantly shorter than today. Many of the illnesses we now easily treat with antibiotics or prevent with vaccines, dysentery, tuberculosis, parasitic infections, would have been common and often fatal. You see a woman in the dim light, grinding grain with a saddle quern, a primitive but effective tool where grain is ground by rubbing a smaller stone back and forth on a larger, slightly concave one. It's hard, repetitive work, and her movements are economical, practiced. Dust from the grain fills the air around her. In another corner, a child is listlessly fanning away flies from a sleeping baby. The heat inside the dwelling, while less direct than the sun, is still stifling, the air unmoving. It's like being inside a low mud oven that's slowly baking its occupants. You think about the Viking longhouse again. Yes, it was smoky and cold, and the company was robust. But it also felt somehow more spacious, more communal in a way that this small, stuffy dwelling doesn't. Here, the closeness feels more oppressive, the lack of personal space more acute. The threats feel different too. Not the biting wind or the potential for a long dark winter, but the insidious heat, the ever-present dust, and the unseen menace of disease-carrying insects and vermin. Each environment has its own unique brand of discomfort, its own ways of reminding you that survival was a daily struggle, not a given. You wouldn't last a day here either, probably collapsing from heat stroke or a sudden, phobia-induced meltdown at the sight of a particularly large beetle. Your historical endurance tour is proving to be a powerful lesson in gratitude for modern plumbing, pest control and air conditioning. The oppressive, dusty heat of the Egyptian dwelling shimmers and fades, much like the Viking longhouse before it. You brace yourself for the next historical jump, wondering what particular brand of discomfort awaits. The air changes again, becoming cool, damp, and smelling strongly of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something vaguely medieval. Yes, that's it. You can almost hear the distant, mournful tolling of a church bell and the faint, unhappy bleating of a sheep. You open your eyes to a scene of rustic and rather grim simplicity. Gone are the sun-baked mud bricks and the vast desert sky. You're now standing in a muddy, rutted track, surrounded by small, dilapidated hovels that look like they're slowly sinking into the earth. Welcome, it seems, to the life of a medieval peasant. Your historical suffering bingo card is getting impressively full. The dwelling you find yourself near is a masterpiece of medieval misery. It's a small one-room hut, constructed from wattle and daub, a framework of woven branches plastered with mud, straw, and animal dung. That popular building material seems to be a recurring theme. With a thatched roof that looks leaky, and home to several generations of birds, and possibly a family of particularly adventurous squirrels. There are no windows, or perhaps just one tiny unglazed slit that lets in a sliver of grey light, but mostly serves as an entry point for wind, rain, and inquisitive insects. The door is a crude affair of rough planks that hangs crookedly on leather hinges. It's a far cry from the relatively grand, by comparison, Viking longhouse, or even the more structured Egyptian mud brick house. This is basic shelter, pushed to its absolute limits. You tentatively push open the creaky door and stoop to enter. The interior is even darker and more cramped than you imagined. The floor is beaten earth, damp and uneven. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, from a small, inefficient hearth in the centre that's doing a terrible job of channeling smoke out through a hole in the roof. Unwashed bodies, hello again old friend, stale food and the general miasma of poverty and dampness. It's cold, not the biting, clean cold of the Viking north, but a penetrating, clammy dampness that seems to seep into your bones. You can see your breath fogging in the dim light, a mainstream historical fact. The vast majority of the population in medieval Europe were peasants, or serfs, tied to the land and owing service and a share of their produce to the lord of the manor. Their lives were characterized by unrelenting agricultural labor, poverty, and a high degree of subservience. They lived in small, often self-built, hovels like this one, usually clustered together in villages surrounded by the fields they worked. Freedom was limited, and opportunities for social advancement were virtually non-existent. Your life was, for the most part, predetermined by your birth. You can just about make out a few meagre possessions in the gloom. A rough wooden bench or stool, a pile of straw in one corner that presumably serves as a bed, shared by the entire family no doubt, a few crude pottery bowls, and perhaps an iron cooking pot hanging over the sad little fire. There's no privacy, no comfort, no beauty. It's shelter in its most elemental form, a place to escape the worst of the weather and huddle together for warmth. You remember the Viking longhouse with its firs and its relatively more spacious interior, and it suddenly seems like a palace. Even the Egyptian mud hut, with its promise of at least escaping the direct sun, had a certain grim appeal compared to this damp, dark hole. And what about those feudal obligations? As a peasant living on a lord's manor, you wouldn't just be toiling on your own small patch of land, if you were lucky enough to have one. You'd also be required to work a certain number of days a week on the lord's domain, his personal land, without pay. This was corvée labour. On top of that, you'd owe him a portion of your own harvest, various taxes and fees for using the Lord's mill to grind your grain, his oven to bake your bread, or his wine press. It was a system designed to keep the peasant class impoverished and dependent. Forget about saving up for a better life. You were perpetually struggling just to meet your obligations and feed your family. It's like having a really, really bad landlord who also happens to be your boss and the local government. A quirky, though rather depressing tidbit about medieval peasant life is the right of merchant, a fee paid to the lord when a peasant's daughter married, or leerwight, a fine paid if a peasant woman was found to be unchaste. These were just more ways for the lord to extract wealth from his tenants and exert control over their lives. It paints a rather bleak picture of personal autonomy. Historians still argue about the degree of variation in peasant living standards across different regions of Europe and throughout the medieval period, which, remember, spans 1,000 years. Conditions were not uniformly terrible everywhere all the time. Some peasants, particularly those with larger landholdings or specialised skills, might have achieved a modest level of prosperity. But for many, life was a precarious existence, lived on the very edge of subsistence, vulnerable to famine, disease, and the whims of their overlords. The hovel you're currently experiencing feels like it's firmly at the lower end of that spectrum. You imagine trying to raise a family in this single, smoky, damp room, children sleeping on the floor with their parents, animals perhaps brought inside during harsh weather for their warmth and their own safety, adding to the already fragrant atmosphere. Remember the Viking livestock sharing quarters? This is the budget version. The lack of sanitation would have been appalling. No running water, no proper latrines. Waste would have been thrown into a nearby ditch or onto a midden heap, creating a breeding ground for flies and disease. You think back to the relative cleanliness concerns in the Viking longhouse and the Egyptian dwelling. This feels like a whole new level of squalor. The dim light, the constant damp, the pervasive smell of mildew and smoke. It's an assault on the senses that's less dramatic than the Viking longhouse's initial shock or the Egyptian heat, but more insidiously demoralising. This isn't just discomfort, it's a recipe for despair. You can already feel a creeping sense of hopelessness, the kind that might come from a lifetime of unrelenting toil with no prospect of improvement. You wouldn't last a day. You'd probably just curl up on that pile of straw and refuse to move, succumbing to a medieval malaise before lunchtime. Your appreciation for your own centrally heated, well-lit and structurally sound home is reaching astronomical levels, and you haven't even sampled the medieval peasant diet yet. That joy, you suspect, is still to come. You're still reeling from the sheer, unadulterated gloom of the medieval peasant hovel, the damp chill clinging to you like a second skin, when your stomach emits a familiar, plaintive rumble. Ah, yes, the historical culinary tour continues. If Viking porridge and Egyptian bread and beer were adventures, you have a feeling medieval peasant fare is going to be a true test of your gastronomic fortitude. You observe the meagre preparations around the sputtering hearth. No bustling activity here, no large cauldrons bubbling with mysterious stews, just a sense of making do with very, very little. The diet of a medieval peasant was, to put it mildly, monotonous and heavily reliant on whatever grains could be grown locally, typically barley, oats, rye, and perhaps some wheat, if they were lucky, or the land was particularly good. This was supplemented with vegetables from their own small garden plots. The pottage garden, so named because its produce usually ended up in the pottage pot. Think onions, leeks, peas, beans, cabbage, and various root vegetables. Fruit might come from foraging, berries, apples, nuts, or from a few carefully tended trees. Meat was a rarity, a luxury. The lord of the manor usually had hunting rights in the surrounding forests, and poaching was severely punished. Peasants might keep a pig, which could forage for itself, or some chickens, but these were valuable assets, more likely to be sold or consumed on special occasions than as a daily staple. Fish, if there was a nearby river or pond not exclusively controlled by the lord, might provide some protein. The cornerstone of the peasant diet was pottage. This was a thick stew or soup made from grains, often oats or barley, whatever vegetables were on hand, and perhaps some peas or beans for protein. It would simmer away over the fire for hours, often with new ingredients added as they became available. A bit like that Viking communal pot, but likely with even fewer exciting additions. Salt was available, but other seasonings were scarce or expensive. Herbs from the garden might add some flavour. It was filling, it was usually nutritious enough to keep you going, but it was incredibly bland and repetitive. Day in, day out pottage. You can almost taste the centuries of culinary boredom. You're offered a wooden bowl of this very pottage. It's a brownish-grey sludge, thick and lumpy, with unidentifiable bits of vegetable matter floating in it. It smells vaguely of cabbage and damp earth. You take a tentative spoonful. It's bland. So incredibly bland. And the texture is a bit like wallpaper paste. It's not actively offensive like you imagine fermented shark might be, but it's profoundly uninspiring. This is fuel, pure and simple, designed to provide enough energy for a long day of backbreaking labour in the fields. There's no joy in it, no celebration of flavour or texture, just sustenance. You find yourself missing the aggressive saltiness of the Viking porridge. At least that had a flavour. Bread, when they had it, would also be a coarse, dark affair, likely made from rye or barley flour, often unleavened or poorly leavened, resulting in a heavy, dense loaf. Remember that Viking bread that could double as a doorstop? This would be its slightly more depressing cousin. Sometimes, in times of famine, flour would be bulked out with less palatable ingredients like ground acorns, beans, or even tree bark. You eye a hunk of dark bread offered with your pottage. It looks like it could survive re-entry from orbit. And then there were the maladies. Life as a medieval peasant was a constant battle against disease, much of which was poorly understood and untreatable. The cramped, unsanitary living conditions, the contaminated water sources, remember those open ditches and midden heaps, and the often inadequate nutrition created a perfect storm for illness. A mainstream historical fact. Epidemics like dysentery, typhus, influenza, and smallpox swept through medieval populations with devastating regularity. And then, of course, there was the Black Death in the 14th century, which wiped out a huge percentage of Europe's population. Even common infections from minor wounds could be fatal without antibiotics. Medical care was rudimentary at best. For peasants, it would likely consist of folk remedies, herbal concoctions, some of which might have had genuine, if limited, efficacy, and prayers. Barber surgeons might perform basic procedures like bloodletting, a common treatment for almost everything, based on the theory of balancing the body's humours, or tooth extraction, but their skills were limited and hygiene was non-existent. You imagine getting a toothache in this environment and shudder. No anaesthetic, just a pair of rusty pliers and a prayer. A quirky, or perhaps just grim, tidbit about medieval health is the prevalence of ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. This was a disease caused by consuming rye contaminated with the ergot fungus. Symptoms included convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, and a terrifying burning sensation in the limbs. Outbreaks could affect entire villages if the rye harvest was bad. It's a stark reminder of how closely life was tied to the food supply, and how easily that supply could become a source of suffering. Historians still argue about the average life expectancy of medieval peasants. Estimates vary, but it was certainly much lower than today, likely in the range of 30 to 35 years, though this figure is skewed by very high rates of infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 40s or 50s, but a long life was by no means guaranteed, and it would likely be a life marked by chronic aches and pains from hard labour, recurring illnesses, and the constant threat of something worse. You look at the people in this hovel. Their faces are weathered, their bodies often showing the signs of toil and hardship, perhaps a limp, a missing tooth, a persistent cough. Yet there's a resilience there too, a stoicism born of necessity. They endured, they had to. You try to eat more of the pottage, forcing it down. It sits heavy in your stomach. You think of your own access to a varied diet, clean water, and modern medicine. Luxuries you take for granted, but which would seem like unimaginable miracles to the people of this time. The combination of monotonous, often inadequate food, and the constant threat of rampant, misunderstood diseases paints a truly bleak picture. Your why you wouldn't last a day hypothesis is holding up remarkably well. Here, it wouldn't just be the discomfort or the labour, it would be the constant grinding fear of starvation or sickness, the sheer precariousness of existence. You'd probably succumb to a fit of existential despair before the dysentery even had a chance to get you, or maybe just expire from sheer boredom with the pottage. The damp, despair-inducing gloom of the medieval peasant hovel dissolves, and you find yourself blinking in what is, by comparison, a more bustling and architecturally ambitious environment. But don't get too excited. The air that hits you is a truly staggering concoction of smells, a complex bouquet that makes the Viking longhouse seem like a pleasantly scented candle shop. You're standing in a narrow cobblestone street, hemmed in by tall timber-framed buildings that lean precariously towards each other, almost blotting out the sky. The noise is cacophonous, the rattle of iron-wheeled carts, the shouts of street vendors, the clang of a distant blacksmith's hammer, dogs barking, children screaming, and a general hubbub of human activity. Welcome, you surmise, to the urban squalor of an early modern European city, perhaps sometime in the 17th century. Think London or Paris before Haussmann and the advent of modern sanitation. It's vibrant and incredibly smelly. The street itself is a marvel of filth. The cobblestones are slick with mud, animal droppings, horses are the main mode of transport and they are not house-trained, and household waste. There are no proper sewers. People simply toss their garbage, including the contents of their chamber pots, out of the windows into the street below, often with a cursory shout of "Gardez-l'eau," from the French "Gardez l'eau." Watch out for the water. You quickly learn to hug the walls and keep an eye on the upper windows. It's like playing a very high-stakes game of dodgeball, where the balls are, well, you get the idea. Gutters, if they exist, are open channels running down the centre or sides of the street, choked with refuse and stagnant water, emitting an aroma that could stun a yak at 50 paces. You thought the medieval peasant hovel was bad for sanitation? This is that, concentrated and amplified by thousands of people living cheek by jowl. The buildings loom over you, their upper stories often jettied out over the street, further reducing light and airflow. They are picturesque in a grimy, haphazard way, but also tinderboxes. Fire was a constant hazard in these densely packed cities built largely of wood and plaster. A stray spark from a hearth or a dropped candle could quickly lead to a devastating conflagration. You recall reading about the Great Fire of London in 1666, which destroyed a huge portion of the medieval city. Living here would mean constantly being aware of that threat. A mainstream historical fact. Urban populations in Europe grew significantly during the early modern period, but infrastructure like clean water supplies and waste disposal systems lagged far behind. This led to incredibly unsanitary conditions and made cities breeding grounds for disease. Typhus, sometimes called jail fever, because it was so common in prisons, typhoid, dysentery and cholera outbreaks were frequent and deadly. And, of course, the plague, while its most devastating pandemic was in the 14th century, continued to make terrifying reappearances. You instinctively pull your collar up, as if that could offer any protection against the miasma of potential pathogens you're currently inhaling. Personal hygiene in this environment was a challenge, to say the least. While the wealthy might have access to private baths or at least basins of clean water, for the average city dweller, bathing was infrequent. Water was often scarce and potentially contaminated, and public bathhouses, which had been more common in earlier periods, had largely fallen out of favour, partly due to concerns about morality and the spread of disease, ironically. People relied on perfumes, powders and linen clothes, which were changed more frequently than outer garments and believed to absorb bodily grime, to maintain a semblance of cleanliness. You can already feel a layer of city grime settling on your skin, a sticky, unpleasant film. You miss the Viking sauna, however hypothetical it was, and the noise. It's relentless. Hawkers cry their wares, fresh oysters, zrenia, graci piroshki, zrenia, any old rags or bones, competing with the rumble of carts, the hammering of artisans, tanners, blacksmiths, coopers, weavers, all plying their trades in small workshops that often open directly onto the street, and the general din of a populace living at very close quarters. There's no escaping it. It's a far cry from the relative quiet of the peasant village, or even the more subdued sounds within the longhouse or Egyptian dwelling. This is the sound of commerce, of a city teeming with life, but it's also overwhelming and exhausting to your modern ears, accustomed to double glazing and noise-cancelling headphones. A quirky tidbit about early modern urban life: watch out for the pigs. In many cities, pigs were allowed to roam freely, acting as a sort of unofficial and highly inefficient street cleaning service, consuming some of the organic waste. While perhaps marginally helpful, they also added to the general chaos and, of course, contributed their own unique droppings to the rich tapestry of the streets. You see a rather large sow rooting contentedly in a pile of garbage just a few feet away, and make a mental note to give it a wide berth. Historians still argue about the overall quality of life for the urban poor during this period. While cities offered opportunities for work and social interaction not found in rural areas, they also presented immense challenges: overcrowding, squalor, disease, crime, and often grinding poverty for those at the bottom of the social ladder. Tenement buildings were packed with families, often living in single squalid rooms. Unemployment or illness could quickly lead to destitution. You see figures huddled in doorways, ragged and gaunt, a stark reminder of the precariousness of life for many. You think about the "why you wouldn't last a day" challenge. Here, the threats are manifold. You could be felled by a random chamber pot emptying from above. You could trip in the filth-laden street and get some horrifying infection. You could be crushed by a runaway cart. You could simply succumb to one of the many diseases festering in the unsanitary conditions. Or the sheer, unrelenting sensory overload, the noise, the smells, the press of bodies, might just cause a complete system shutdown. It's a world away from your ordered, sanitized, and relatively quiet modern existence. You're starting to develop a profound respect for anyone who managed to survive, let alone thrive, in such an environment. Your desire for a long, hot bath and a bottle of industrial-strength hand sanitizer has reached critical levels, and you haven't even considered what you might be offered for lunch in this charming metropolis. The cacophony and ripe odours of the 17th century city thankfully begin to recede, and you find yourself transitioning once more. This time the shift is less jarring in terms of immediate sensory assault, but perhaps more subtly unsettling. You're still in a city, but the architecture is grander, more imposing. Carriages, sleeker and more numerous than the carts of the previous era, clatter on paved streets. Men in top hats and women in elaborate bustle dresses hurry along surprisingly clean, by comparison, sidewalks. There's a sense of order, of progress, but also a certain stiffness. You've arrived, it seems, in the Victorian era, sometime in the mid to late 19th century. This is the age of steam, of empire, of great scientific advancement, but also of profound social contrasts and some truly bizarre notions of comfort and propriety. While the streets are visibly cleaner than the 17th century nightmare you just escaped, thanks in part to major sanitation reforms like the construction of extensive sewer systems in 1898 cities like London, a direct response to events like the Great Stink of 1858 when the Thames was overwhelmed with raw sewage. Don't be fooled into thinking it's all roses and lavender. Coal smoke from countless factory chimneys and domestic hearths hangs heavy in the air, creating a perpetual smog that coats buildings in a layer of soot and can, on bad days, make breathing difficult. This is the infamous pea super fog you've read about. So while you might not be dodging flying chamber pots, your lungs are still getting a historical workout. A mainstream historical fact, the Victorian era was a period of immense industrialisation and urbanisation, leading to massive population growth in cities. This created unprecedented wealth for some, but also appalling poverty and overcrowding for many others, living in sprawling slums often hidden just behind the grand facades of the prosperous thoroughfares. The contrast between the lives of the rich and the poor was stark and often brutal. You see a wealthy family stepping from a fine carriage, dressed in expensive clothes, while just a few yards away, a ragged child with bare feet tries to sell matches. It's a disquieting juxtaposition. Let's consider the comforts, or lack thereof, within a typical middle-class Victorian home. While they might have had flushing toilets, a spreading but not yet universal marvel, and perhaps even a dedicated bathroom, heating was still primarily by coal fires in individual rooms. This meant rooms were often drafty and unevenly heated, warm near the fireplace, frigid elsewhere, and keeping those fires going and cleaning up the soot and ash was a constant, laborious task, usually performed by domestic servants. If you didn't have servants, your life would revolve around the tyranny of the coal scuttle and the hearth brush. And the clothing, oh, the glorious suffocating clothing. For women, this meant corsets that cinched the waist to an often unhealthy degree, multiple layers of petticoats, heavy skirts and elaborate bodices. Movement was restricted, breathing could be difficult, and just getting dressed was a major undertaking. Men fared somewhat better, but their formal attire of stiff collars, cravats, wool suits, and top hats was hardly the epitome of comfort, especially in warmer weather. You, in your increasingly anachronistic and travel-stained attire, feel both underdressed and blessedly unconstricted by comparison. You can't imagine trying to navigate a busy street, let alone perform any actual work, while encased in a Victorian corset. You'd probably faint from lack of oxygen before breakfast. A quirky and rather alarming tidbit from the Victorian era is the widespread use of arsenic and lead in everyday products. Arsenic was used as a pigment in green dyes for wallpaper and clothing, and even in some cosmetics and medicines. Lead was common in paint, water pipes, and even some food adulteration. The long-term health consequences of this casual poisoning were often severe, though not always understood at the time. So that lovely emerald green wallpaper in the drawing room? Potentially a toxic hazard. That health tonic you bought from the chemist might just be slowly killing you. It makes you appreciate modern product safety regulations. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of Victorian social mores. The emphasis on propriety, reputation, and the strict segregation of public and private spheres, along with the repression of emotions and sexuality, created a society that was, in many ways, deeply constrained. The ideal of the angel in the house for women, the pressures on men to be stoic providers, the intense scrutiny of social conduct, it all contributed to a certain societal anxiety. While on the surface it might appear more civilized than the raucous eras you've previously visited, there was an undercurrent of tension and often hypocrisy. Even leisure had its discomforts. Think of those early bone-shaker bicycles, or the rigid formality of a Victorian dinner party with its endless courses and strict rules of etiquette. Or consider the popular seaside holidays where bathing machines were used to preserve modesty, trundling swimmers into the chilly sea in what amounted to a small wooden hut on wheels. It's a far cry from a casual day at the beach. The advances were undeniable. Railways revolutionising travel, the telegraph shrinking communication distances, medical breakthroughs like anaesthesia and antiseptic surgery, though the latter was slow to be adopted. But these advancements coexisted with profound social problems and some truly baffling discomforts. You see a gas lamp being lit on the street as dusk begins to fall, a symbol of modern progress. Yet, in a nearby alleyway, you glimpse the shadowy entrance to what is likely a squalid, overcrowded tenement, a symbol of enduring poverty. This era feels different from the others. The threats are less about immediate raw survival, though for the very poor that was still a daily reality, and more about navigating a complex, often contradictory society. It's about conforming to rigid expectations, enduring physical discomforts in the name of fashion or propriety, and breathing air thick with coal smoke. You wouldn't last a day, perhaps not because of imminent peril, but because you'd inadvertently commit some dreadful social faux pas, or simply because your modern desire for comfortable clothing and clean air would become unbearable. The Victorian era, for all its grandeur and innovation, seems to have perfected the art of polite discomfort. And you are definitely not dressed for the occasion. The clatter of Victorian carriages and the scent of coal smoke seem to be swept away by an immense sighing wind. The grand, soot-stained buildings dissolve, replaced by an endless, undulating expanse of grass, under a sky so vast it feels almost oppressive. You're standing on the American prairie, sometime in the latter half of the 19th century. Gone is the polite, if sometimes suffocating, society of the Victorian city. Here, there is only the wind, the grass, and a profound, almost terrifying sense of isolation. If you are seeking an escape from the constraints of corsets and urban smog, you've certainly found it, though you may have traded one set of profound discomforts for another, far more elemental kind. Your historical endurance test continues, this time on the windswept plains where pioneer spirit met a very harsh reality. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer emptiness. The horizon stretches in every direction, an unbroken line where the pale grass meets the impossibly big sky. There are no trees, no familiar landmarks, just mile upon mile of waving prairie grass. The wind is a constant companion, sometimes a gentle whisper, other times a howling gale that seems to scour the very soul. It whips at your increasingly tattered clothes, which are once again woefully inappropriate for your new surroundings, and fills your ears with a ceaseless rushing sound. It's like the universe forgot to put anything else here, except grass and regret. You spot it in the distance, a low, dark hump on the landscape, looking more like a natural feature than a human dwelling. This, you realise, is your new home, a sod house, or soddy. As you get closer, you see it's constructed from large bricks of prairie turf, stacked like oversized grassy Legos. The roof is also made of sod, laid over a framework of whatever scarce timber could be found or afforded, perhaps cottonwood poles from a distant riverbank. A mainstream historical fact for you: the Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged settlement of the American West by offering 160 acres of federal land to citizens who were willing to live on it, cultivate it, and build a dwelling. For many pioneers, timber was scarce and expensive, making sod the most practical and often only building material available. Building one of these was back-breaking labour. Imagine cutting through the thick, tangled roots of prairie grass with a breaking plough, wrestling heavy strips of sod, often called prairie marble with a good dose of irony, into place, layer by layer. Your shoulders ache just thinking about it. The walls are thick, offering surprisingly good insulation against the brutal prairie winters and the scorching summer heat. But the interior, well, it's an acquired taste. You duck through a low doorway. It's dark, the only light coming from the doorway itself and perhaps a single small greased paper window. The floor is packed earth again. The air smells strongly of damp soil, old grass, and a faint smoky scent from a small stove or hearth, fueled by precious wood or more likely dried buffalo or cow chips. Yes, you read that right. Fuel was so scarce that prairie coal, animal dung, was a common and necessary resource. Romantic, isn't it? The ceiling is low, and you can see the underside of the sod roof, complete with dangling grass roots, and, you suspect, a thriving ecosystem of insects and small creatures. A quirky and rather unsettling tidbit about sod houses is that they were notorious for dropping dirt, debris, and unwelcome visitors, like mice, spiders, and even the occasional snake from the ceiling, especially after a rain. Families often stretched canvas or cloth under the worst spots to catch the fallout. Dinner and shower all at once. Life here is a relentless struggle against the elements and the unyielding land. Farming this virgin prairie was incredibly tough. The sod was thick and hard to break. Droughts were frequent, searing the crops in the fields. Blizzards in winter could rage for days, isolating families completely and threatening livestock. Prairie fires, sparked by lightning or human carelessness, could sweep across the plains with terrifying speed, destroying everything in their path. And then there were the plagues of grasshoppers or locusts, which could descend in biblical swarms and devour an entire season's crops in a matter of hours. It's like Mother Nature was actively trying to discourage settlement, throwing everything she had at these determined, or perhaps just desperate, pioneers. Daily chores would be endless: hauling water from a distant well or creek, tending the small vegetable garden, if you were lucky enough to get one established, caring for the few animals you might own, mending clothes, grinding corn, preparing meagre meals from a limited pantry of flour, salt pork, and whatever you could grow or hunt. There's no popping down to the shops for a forgotten ingredient. The nearest neighbour might be miles away, the nearest town a day's journey or more. The isolation could be crushing, especially for women, who often bore the brunt of domestic labour and childcare in these remote, lonely settings. Historians still debate the extent to which the romanticised pioneer spirit, that image of rugged individualism and triumphant self-reliance, accurately reflects the often brutal, desperate, and soul-crushingly lonely realities faced by many homesteaders. While stories of resilience and community are certainly true, so too are stories of failure, despair, mental breakdown, and families forced to abandon their claims after years of fruitless struggle. It wasn't a picturesque adventure for everyone. For many, it was a grim battle for survival. You imagine the long winters, cooped up in this small, dark, earthy space, the wind howling outside, supplies dwindling, or the scorching summers, the sun beating down relentlessly, the air thick with dust, the constant fear of drought. You think about the lack of medical care, the nearest doctor perhaps 100 miles away. A simple injury, a common illness, could become a life-threatening crisis. You wouldn't last a day. You'd probably take one look at the endless horizon, the complete lack of Wi-Fi, and the prospect of collecting buffalo chips for fuel, and immediately demand to be returned to the relative comforts of the Victorian smog. At least there you could get a newspaper. This is a different kind of hard, a solitude and self-reliance that your modern, hyper-connected soul finds deeply intimidating. The prairie offers little comfort, only the stark demand to endure. The vast windswept prairie shimmers and fades, the smell of damp earth and buffalo chips replaced by the much less wholesome aroma of bilge water, tar, unwashed bodies, a recurring theme in your historical travels it seems, and the faint metallic tang of old fear. The endless grass gives way to splintered, weathered wood beneath your feet, and the sighing wind is now the snap and creak of rigging and the rhythmic slosh of waves against a hull. You've been transported, rather alarmingly, to the deck of a 17th or early 18th century pirate ship. Avast, ye landlubber. Your historical discomfort tour has taken a decidedly nautical and likely very unpleasant turn. Forget the swashbuckling romance. The reality of life aboard a pirate vessel was mostly grim, brutal, and short. The first thing that hits you, after the smell, is the sheer claustrophobic lack of space. The deck is crowded with rough-looking men, a motley collection of nationalities and temperaments, all armed to the teeth with pistols, cutlasses, and a general air of simmering violence. The ship itself, whether a captured merchantman or a purpose-built sloop, is small, cramped, and clearly designed for fighting and speed, not comfort. Below decks, where the majority of the crew would eat and sleep, conditions would be even worse, dark, airless, and perpetually damp. You can almost feel the rats scurrying in the bilges. Remember the Viking longhouse's communal sleeping arrangements? This is that, but on a rolling pitching platform, with a much higher chance of scurvy and a significantly lower chance of surviving a workplace dispute. Food and water were constant preoccupations. A mainstream historical fact. Provisions on long voyages were notoriously poor. Drinking water, stored in wooden casks, quickly became slimy and foul. Food consisted mainly of salted meat, beef or pork, so heavily brined it was almost inedible, often referred to as salt horse. Hardtack, a dry, incredibly hard biscuit, frequently infested with weevils. Sailors joked about eating them in the dark so you couldn't see what else you were consuming, and perhaps some dried peas or beans. Fresh food was a rare luxury, usually only available immediately after raiding a ship or landing ashore. This poor diet led inevitably to deficiency diseases like scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, which resulted in rotting gums, open sores, and eventually death. You eye a barrel labelled biscuits, with deep suspicion, and make a mental note to politely decline any culinary offerings. Your teeth already feel a bit loose just thinking about it. Then there's the hygiene, or rather, the almost complete lack of it. Bathing was infrequent, if ever. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing. The heads, the ship's toilets, were often just platforms or seats extending over the side of the ship, usually near the bow, offering a very public and often very splashy experience, especially in rough seas. With dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men crammed into a small vessel for months on end, with no laundry facilities and minimal personal cleanliness, the stench must have been overpowering, and of course this environment was a paradise for lice, fleas, and disease. Typhus, again, dysentery and various fevers would sweep through a ship's crew with deadly efficiency. You suddenly feel an intense nostalgia for the relatively benign grime of the prairie sod house. Discipline aboard a pirate ship, while perhaps less formally structured than a naval vessel, could be incredibly brutal. While pirate crews often operated under a set of articles, or a code of conduct that they all agreed to, a surprisingly democratic feature, often outlining shares of plunder and rules for onboard behaviour, punishments for infractions could be swift and savage. Flogging was common. Keel hauling, where a man was dragged under the ship's hull from one side to the other, was a particularly gruesome punishment, often resulting in death or severe injury from barnacles and drowning. Marooning, being abandoned on a deserted island with minimal supplies, was another favourite. You observe the hard, weathered faces around you, the casual way they handle their weapons, and decide that absolute, unquestioning obedience is your only viable strategy here. This is not the place for witty banter or questioning authority. A quirky, though grim, tidbit about pirate life is the constant threat from within. While united against their prey, pirate crews were often volatile collections of desperate men. Disputes over plunder, accusations of cheating, or simple personality clashes could easily erupt into violence. Trust was a fragile commodity. The captain, often elected by the crew, ruled by a combination of charisma, ruthlessness, and the ability to deliver results, i.e., successful raids. A captain who failed to bring in loot, or who was perceived as unfair, could quickly find himself facing a mutiny. It's like a high-stakes corporate environment, but with more cutlasses and fewer HR complaints. Historians still argue about the true motivations and character of the average pirate. Were they all bloodthirsty villains, or were some driven by desperation, escaping harsh naval discipline or poverty? The reality is likely a complex mix. Many were undoubtedly hardened criminals, but others may have seen piracy as a form of rebellion, or simply the best available option in a brutal world. Regardless of their motivations, their lives were almost invariably short and violent. The average career of a pirate lasted only a few years, ending in battle, shipwreck, disease, or at the end of a hangman's rope. You cling to a railing as the ship pitches and rolls, the deck slick with sea spray and who knows what else. The noise is a constant assault. The creak of timbers, the roar of the wind in the rigging, the shouts of the crew, the crash of waves. There is no peace, no quiet, no escape. And always, there's the underlying tension, the knowledge that at any moment you could be plunged into a desperate, bloody battle for your life, or succumb to some foul disease in a cramped, stinking hammock. You wouldn't last a day. You'd probably be seasick within the first hour, incapacitated by the smell within 2, and either thrown overboard as useless or dead from sheer terror before sunset. Your appreciation for dry land, stable flooring, and non-weevil infested food is growing exponentially. The pirate life is definitely not for you. The pitching deck of the pirate ship and the stench of the high seas dissolve, and you find yourself on solid, sun-baked earth once more. But this is no windswept prairie. The air is hot, dry, and carries the scent of dust, sweat, and something else. A faint coppery tang that makes the hairs on the back of your neck prickle. You're in a large sandy enclosure surrounded by high walls. Other men, stripped to loincloths, their bodies glistening with sweat and marked with scars, are engaged in strenuous, repetitive exercises, practicing with wooden swords, lunging at straw dummies, wrestling in the dust. The atmosphere is one of brutal discipline and barely suppressed aggression. You've landed, it seems, in a ludus, a Roman gladiator school. Your historical discomfort tour has just taken a turn towards a very specific, very deadly form of entertainment, and you, my friend, look like fresh, untrained meat. The life of a trainee gladiator or tiro was one of unremitting hardship and constant danger. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war or condemned criminals, though some free men, often desperate or debt-ridden, volunteered, seeking fame or fortune. Regardless of their origin, once they entered the ludus, their lives were no longer their own. They were property, bought and trained by a lanista, the owner and head trainer of the school, to fight and die for the entertainment of the Roman masses. Forget any romantic notions of noble warriors choosing their fate. This was a brutal, exploitative business. The training was incredibly rigorous and designed to turn raw recruits into efficient killing machines. A mainstream historical fact. Gladiators were highly specialized, trained in specific fighting styles with particular types of weapons and armor, like the Murmillo with his large shield and sword, the Retiarius with his net and trident, or the Thraex with his small shield and curved dagger. This specialization made for more interesting and varied matchups in the arena. Your training would focus on one such style, endlessly drilling techniques, building strength and stamina, and learning to endure pain. You watch a trainer, a hard-bitten veteran with a whip in his hand, savagely berating a clumsy recruit. Discipline is harsh and immediate. There are no appeals, no gentle corrections. Failure to perform could result in a beating, or worse. The living conditions in the ludus were basic and crowded. Gladiators lived in small cells, often sleeping on straw. Diet, however, was usually a point of focus for the lanista. While not luxurious, it was designed to build muscle and strength. They were often fed a high-carbohydrate diet, rich in barley, earning them the nickname hordiari, or barley men, beans, and other energy-giving foods. This sometimes resulted in them being a bit on the chubby side by modern athletic standards, but that layer of subcutaneous fat could offer some protection against superficial cuts in the arena. You look at your own physique, decidedly unbarley-fed, and feel a pang of inadequacy. You're not sure you're built for this kind of sustained, brutal physical exertion. And then there was the constant shadow of the arena. Every training session, every drill, was a preparation for that moment when you would step out onto the sand before a roaring crowd to fight for your life. The psychological pressure must have been immense. While not every gladiatorial contest ended in death, experienced, skilled gladiators were valuable investments, and a reprieve granted to a defeated but brave gladiator, was not uncommon. The risk was always there. A thumbs down from the crowd or the editor of the games could mean a swift, brutal end. You imagine the roar of the Colosseum, the smell of blood and fear, and a cold dread settles in your stomach. A quirky, though rather morbid tidbit about gladiator schools is the collegia, or brotherhoods, that often formed among the gladiators. Despite being trained to fight each other, these men, living and training in close, harsh conditions, often developed strong bonds of camaraderie and mutual support. They might contribute to burial funds for fallen comrades, or look out for each other within the brutal confines of the ludus. It's a poignant reminder of humanity finding ways to assert itself even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Historians still argue about the exact odds of survival for a gladiator. While popular culture often portrays it as a near-certain death sentence, archaeological evidence, such as gladiator cemeteries showing many healed wounds, and written sources suggest that some gladiators could survive for many fights, even achieving a degree of fame and very rarely freedom, symbolized by the awarding of a wooden sword, the rudis. However, it was undeniably a high-risk profession. Injury was almost certain, and a disabling wound could end a career, leaving a gladiator with little future. You're prodded forward by a stern-looking guard and handed a heavy wooden practice sword. It feels awkward and unwieldy in your hand. The other Tyrones eye you with a mixture of indifference and predatory curiosity. You are the newcomer, the unknown quantity, the potential future opponent. The discipline, the constant physical exertion, the ever-present threat of violence and death. It's a world away from anything you've ever known. There are no sick days here, no opting out because you're not feeling it. Your body is a commodity, a tool to be honed and then risked for public spectacle. You wouldn't last a day. You'd probably collapse from exhaustion during the first morning's training drills, or inadvertently insult a veteran gladiator and find yourself on the receiving end of some very painful, non-practice retribution. Or the sheer, mind-numbing terror of knowing what awaited you in the arena would simply break you. The roar of the distant imaginary crowd already sounds deafening. This isn't just about physical discomfort. It's about the complete stripping away of autonomy and the constant intimate acquaintance with mortality. Your appreciation for a quiet, non-combat-oriented desk job has just reached an all-time high. The hot sun and sandy grit of the Roman gladiator school dissolve, replaced by a choking, chemical-tinged thug and the deafening, relentless metallic clang and roar of machinery. You're indoors now, in a vast, gloomy space, poorly lit by a few grimy windows high up in the brick walls. The air is thick with coal smoke, cotton dust, and the smell of oil and unwashed humanity. Rows upon rows of clattering, vibrating machines stretch as far as you can see, tended by pale, gaunt figures, men, women, and distressingly, many children. Their movements quick and repetitive, their faces smudged with grime and weariness. Welcome to the heart of an early industrial revolution factory, likely a textile mill in 19th century Britain. Your historical discomfort tour has now plunged you into the grinding, soul-destroying toil that powered a new age of production, but at a terrible human cost. The noise is the first thing that overwhelms you. It's not just loud, it's a physical assault, a constant brain-numbing cacophony that makes conversation impossible and thought difficult. The thunder of power looms, the screech of spinning jennies, the hiss of steam engines. It all blends into a monstrous mechanical symphony that vibrates through the very floorboards and into your bones. You instinctively cover your ears, but it does little good. You can't imagine enduring this for 12, 14 or even 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, which was standard for many factory workers. Then there's the air, or rather, the lack of it. The atmosphere is thick with pollutants. If it's a cotton mill, fine cotton fibres fill the air, clogging lungs and leading to respiratory diseases like byssinosis, or brown lung. Coal smoke from the steam engines that power the machinery belches out both inside and outside the factory, contributing to the infamous urban smog you glimpsed in the Victorian era, but here you're at its source. Ventilation is minimal, the windows often kept closed to maintain humidity levels necessary for textile production, or simply because they're too high and dirty to open. You're already coughing, your eyes stinging from the acrid air. A mainstream historical fact, the Industrial Revolution brought about unprecedented technological advancements and economic growth, but for the first generations of factory workers, it often meant a drastic decline in living standards and quality of life compared to their previous agrarian or artisanal existences. They traded the seasonal rhythms of farm work for the relentless, machine-paced discipline of the factory, often for pitifully low wages. There were no safety regulations, no worker protections. The machinery was dangerous with exposed gears, belts, and shafts ready to snatch unwary hands, hair, or clothing, leading to horrific injuries and fatalities. You see a child no older than 8 or 9 darting under a massive clattering loom to retrieve a fallen shuttle, a hair's breadth from disaster, and your heart lurches. The work itself is mind-numbingly repetitive and physically exhausting. You're assigned a task, perhaps piecing together broken threads on a spinning machine or feeding raw cotton into a carding engine, and you must perform it over and over at speed for hours on end under the watchful eye of an overseer who won't tolerate slackness. The pace is dictated by the machines, not by human capacity. A moment's inattention can lead to a mistake, a reprimand, a docked wage, or worse, a serious accident. Your muscles quickly begin to ache, your back protests, and your mind rebels against the sheer, soul-crushing monotony. You thought carding, wool in the Viking longhouse was tedious. This is tedium weaponized, amplified by noise, danger, and pollution. And the hours. Oh, the hours. The factory whistle would blow before dawn, summoning workers from their squalid, overcrowded slum dwellings, often located right next to the factory enveloped in its smoke and grime. They would toil until well after dusk, with perhaps a short break for a meagre meal, eaten amidst the noise and filth of the factory floor. There was no concept of a weekend as you know it, perhaps only Sunday off, and often not even that during busy periods. This relentless labour left little time or energy for family life, education, or any form of leisure. It was a cycle of work, eat poorly, sleep fitfully, repeat. A quirky, or rather tragic aspect of early industrial life was the reliance on child labour. Children, with their small, nimble fingers, were considered ideal for certain tasks, especially in textile mills. They were also cheaper to employ and easier to control than adults. Many started working from the age of 5 or 6, enduring the same long hours and dangerous conditions as their parents, for a fraction of the pay. Their childhoods were stolen, their health ruined, their futures bleak. It's a horrifying thought, seeing these small figures toiling amidst the monstrous machinery. Historians still debate the overall impact of the Industrial Revolution, weighing its long-term benefits in terms of technological progress and increased productivity against the immense human suffering it caused in its early stages. While it eventually led to higher living standards for many, for those who lived and died in these first factories, it was often a period of unmitigated misery and exploitation. There were reformers who spoke out against these conditions, like Lord Shaftesbury in Britain, who campaigned for factory acts to limit working hours and improve safety, but progress was slow and hard-won. You wouldn't last a day? You'd probably be deafened by noon, choking on cotton dust by mid-afternoon, and either maimed by a machine or collapsing from sheer exhaustion and despair before your first shift even ended. The sheer, dehumanizing brutality of the environment, the relentless noise, the polluted air, the constant danger, and the crushing monotony. It's a vision of hell forged in iron and steam. Your appreciation for worker rights, safety regulations, Clean Air Acts, and the 8-hour workday skyrockets to an entirely new dimension. This isn't just discomfort, it's a systematic assault on human dignity. The deafening roar of the Industrial Revolution factory fades, the metallic tang of oil and coal smoke replaced by the primal scents of damp earth, cold stone, and the musky aroma of animal hides. The oppressive man-made structures dissolve, and you find yourself in the dim, flickering light of a fire, deep within the mouth of a cave. The air is cold, carrying the distant howl of a wolf and the drip, drip, drip of water seeping through limestone. Rough, unadorned rock walls curve around you, and the floor is uneven, littered with animal bones and chipped stones. You've journeyed back, way back, to the very dawn of human experience, to the life of a prehistoric cave dweller. Your historical endurance test has reached its most elemental, most stripped-down stage. Forget lasting a day. Surviving an hour here will be a profound challenge. The first thing that strikes you is the profound silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the drip of water, and those unnerving sounds from the wilderness outside. It's a silence that speaks of immense solitude and ever-present danger. The comforts of even the most basic historical societies you've visited, the Viking longhouses' communal warmth, the Egyptian villages' shared labour, even the medieval peasants' meagre but established community, are utterly absent here. You are, or at least feel, profoundly alone, reliant on nothing but your own wits, and the most primitive of tools for survival. Shelter is this cave. It offers protection from the worst of the elements, the biting wind, the snow, the rain, and a defensible position against predators. But it's also damp, cold, and utterly without modern amenities. No central heating, no running water, except for that irritating drip, no comfortable Axminster carpet, just cold, hard rock. The fire is the heart of this existence, providing not only warmth and light, but also a means to cook food, if you can get any, and deter the things that lurk in the darkness beyond its flickering glow. Keeping that fire going is a constant, critical task. Running out of fuel isn't an option, a mainstream historical fact. For vast stretches of human prehistory, the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age for instance, which lasted for millions of years, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers, relying on foraging for edible plants and hunting wild animals for sustenance. They lived in small nomadic groups, following animal migrations and seasonal food sources, often using caves or rock shelters as temporary or seasonal homes. Their lives were intimately tied to the natural world, a world that was both provider and constant threat. Food acquisition is the primary all-consuming daily struggle. You see a collection of crudely sharpened sticks, primitive spears, and chipped stone tools that look like they require immense skill and patience to create, let alone use effectively. Hunting would involve tracking animals, often large and dangerous, mammoths, bison, cave bears, using stealth, cooperation, if you're part of a small band, and a deep understanding of animal behaviour. Failure means hunger, injury, without any medical care beyond perhaps some chewed herbs or a poultice of mud, could easily mean death, either from the wound itself or from subsequent infection. Foraging for plants, roots, berries, and nuts would be equally important, requiring extensive knowledge of what was edible and what was poisonous. You look at your own soft hands, utterly unsuited for napping flint or digging for tubers, and feel a profound sense of uselessness. Your survival skills honed by navigating supermarket aisles and online ordering are hilariously inadequate here. And then there are the predators. Saber-toothed cats, giant cave bears, packs of wolves. The prehistoric world was teeming with animals that would view a lone, unskilled human as an easy meal. Every venture out of the cave to hunt, gather, or fetch water would be fraught with peril. Even within the cave, vigilance would be constant, especially at night. The fire is your main defense, but it needs to be fed. You imagine huddling close to the flames, listening to the terrifying roars and snarls from the darkness, hoping the flimsy barrier of firelight will be enough to keep them at bay. A quirky, though perhaps speculative, tidbit about cave life. Some of the earliest art in the world is found in caves. Stunning paintings of animals, hunting scenes, and abstract symbols, created tens of thousands of years ago. What drove these early humans to create such beautiful and often inaccessible art in the depths of dark caves, using primitive pigments and flickering torchlight? Was it ritual, magic, storytelling, or simply an innate human urge to create and make sense of their world? It's a profound mystery that connects us directly to these ancient ancestors. You peer at the cave walls, half expecting to see the faint outline of a bison or a handprint. Historians, or rather prehistorians and archaeologists, still argue about many aspects of daily life in these remote eras, as the evidence is scarce and often open to interpretation. What was the exact nature of their social structures, their belief systems, their communication? We can infer much from skeletal remains, stone tools, and cave art, but many details remain shrouded in the mists of deep time. What is clear is that life was incredibly harsh, a constant struggle for the barest essentials. You shiver despite the fire, The cold from the stone floor seems to seep into your bones. Your modern clothing, which has now been through a Viking longhouse, Egyptian heat, medieval damp, urban grime, Victorian smog, prairie winds, pirate ships, gladiator schools and factory pollution, is practically disintegrating and offers no protection against this primal chill. You are hungry, you are cold, you are probably terrified, and you are acutely aware of your own fragility. There are no easy meals, no secure shelters beyond this cold stone, no guarantees of surviving the next hour, let alone the next day. You wouldn't last a day. You'd likely be dead before your first prehistoric sunrise, eaten by a cave hyena, frozen in your sleep, or perhaps just succumbing to a fatal bout of despair at the sheer, overwhelming bleakness and a sudden, intense craving for a hot shower and a pizza. This is survival in its rawest, most uncompromising form. Every breath, every small success would be a victory. And it makes all the other historical discomforts you've endured seem like minor inconveniences by comparison. Your journey through time has brought you to the very bedrock of human existence, and it is a profoundly humbling and terrifying place to be. The primal chill of the prehistoric cave and the flickering firelight begin to recede, the distant howl of a wolf fading into a gentle, almost imperceptible hum. You feel a sense of lightness returning, a gradual release from the raw elemental fear and the constant gnawing hunger. The cold stone beneath you softens, the damp, earthy smells giving way to something cleaner, more familiar. The oppressive weight of historical discomforts, from the Viking longhouse's acrid smoke and flea-ridden furs, through the Egyptian sun's relentless baking, the medieval peasant's damp hovel, the early modern city's overflowing squalor, the Victorian era's polite suffocation, the prairie pioneer's desolate isolation, the pirate ship's grim realities, the gladiator school's brutal discipline, the Industrial Revolution factory's deafening toil, and finally the cave, dwellers' terrifying struggle for bare existence. All these vivid, uncomfortable snapshots begin to swirl and coalesce in your mind, forming a vast tapestry of human endurance. You find yourself once more in that quiet, neutral space, a sort of gentle interlude between worlds, the same one you visited after your initial batch of historical misadventures. It's a moment to process the extended, even more challenging tour you've just undertaken, a chance to let the sheer, overwhelming otherness of these profoundly difficult past lives settle more deeply. You take a slow, deliberate breath, a genuinely deep, clean breath, and it feels like an even greater luxury than before. The simple act of breathing air that doesn't sting your eyes, choke your lungs with dust or smoke, or carry the stench of disease and decay, is a profound, almost spiritual relief. You reflect on the common threads that ran through all those disparate eras, now with an even greater appreciation for their severity. The constant grinding labour, not just for basic necessities, but often for the mere chance to see another sunrise. The ever-present, inescapable threat of disease, malnutrition and violence, often misunderstood and utterly untreatable, making life a precarious, fleeting gamble. The utter lack of personal space, privacy, or autonomy, concepts so ingrained in your modern sensibilities yet so alien to the communal, hierarchical, or brutally constrained living arrangements of the past. The relentless sensory assaults, the smells, the textures, the noises, the extreme temperatures that would have been the unyielding daily reality for countless generations, but which your 21st century self found almost catastrophically unbearable. Remember the gnawing chill of the longhouse, a cold that seemed to seep into your very bones, only marginally held at bay by a smoky fire and scratchy furs, now amplified by the memory of the prairie blizzard, or the dank cave, or the suffocating heat of the Egyptian sun, beating down on you as you imagine toiling in the dusty fields, now intensified by the memory of the gladiator's sun-baked training yard. The sheer, unrelenting dampness of the medieval hovel, a place where true dryness felt like an impossible dream, made even more poignant by the pirate ship's perpetually soaked timbers, the overwhelming stench and chaos of the early modern city street, a genuine biohazard zone where every step was a gamble, now rivaled by the factory's chemical fug or the pirate's bilge, and even the more civilized Victorian era, with its own peculiar discomforts, seems almost benign compared to the brutal realities of a Roman ludus or the terror of a prehistoric night. A mainstream historical fact which has perhaps become abundantly, almost painfully clear through this extended journey, is that for the overwhelming majority of human history, life for the average person was characterised by unrelenting hardship, terrifying scarcity, and a constant desperate struggle for survival against odds that would make a modern-day adventurer blanch. The comforts and conveniences that you take for granted, clean running water, effective sanitation, readily available and diverse food, powerful and accessible medicine, climate-controlled environments, personal hygiene products, safety regulations, human rights, are incredibly recent, fragile and hard-won developments in the vast timeline of human existence. You think about the incredible resilience, the sheer tenacity of the people you've met in your mind's eye. The Viking, the Egyptian, the peasant, the city dweller, the pioneer, the pirate, the gladiator, the factory worker, the cave dweller. They weren't somehow inherently tougher than you in a purely biological sense, but they were conditioned from the moment of their birth to a level of pervasive hardship, danger, and discomfort that is almost impossible for you to truly comprehend. Their baseline for normal, for what constituted an acceptable day, was so vastly, fundamentally different from yours. A quirky, overarching tidbit from this entire sprawling journey might be the simple, crushing realization of how much effort and risk went into just existing, into merely staying alive. Every mouthful of food, every piece of crude clothing, every moment of relative warmth or shelter was the result of direct, often perilous human labour and a good measure of luck. There were no safety nets, no guarantees, no easy options. This constant, unyielding struggle shaped their bodies, their minds, their communities, and their perception of the world. Historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists will continue to argue, to discover, and to reinterpret the nuances of daily life in these past eras. But the broad strokes, painted now with even more vivid and harrowing detail, remain starkly clear. Life was hard. Life was often brutally short, and life was, by your modern standards, an almost unimaginable litany of discomforts and dangers. Your extended imaginary foray into these worlds, your not lasting a day, or even an hour in some cases in each, has hopefully fostered not a sense of superiority, nor a morbid fascination, but a profound, almost overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the scientific advancements, the social progress, the sheer human ingenuity and empathy that have, for many, transformed the human condition so radically. You realise that the purpose of this journey wasn't just to catalogue historical discomforts for a sleepless night, or to make you feel momentarily smug about your heated blankets, your well-stocked refrigerator, and your extensive tea collection, though those are certainly definitely worth appreciating more than ever. It was to connect, in some small, visceral way, with the vast, deep ocean of human experience that came before you, to understand, even a little, the foundations of suffering and endurance upon which your own relatively comfortable world is built. It's a stark reminder that progress is not linear or inevitable, and that the comforts and freedoms you enjoy are precious, potentially fragile, and were bought at a very high price by those who came before. You feel a new, almost reverent appreciation for your soft bed, your quiet room, the easy availability of a hot shower, the miracle of antibiotics, and the simple, glorious, unadulterated fact that you don't have to fight a cave bear for your breakfast, or worry about being keel-hauled for looking at the captain the wrong way. As these thoughts settle, a deep sense of weariness washes over you, a profound exhaustion, but it's a strangely peaceful weariness, the kind that comes after a long, arduous and deeply thought-provoking journey, the kind that signals an undeniable readiness for genuine, untroubled and profoundly grateful rest. The ghosts of Vikings and Egyptians, of peasants and pioneers, of pirates and gladiators, of factory workers and cave dwellers begin to fade. Their smoky, dusty, damp, dangerous reality is receding as your own comfortable, blessedly safe present reasserts itself with gentle insistence. The soft hum of your fan, perhaps, or the gentle, steady glow of a distant street lamp filtering through your curtains feels wonderfully, reassuringly modern and profoundly peaceful. The trials of the longhouse, the stench of the medieval street, the oppressive heat of the Nile, the grinding toil of the factory, the primal fear of the cave, these are now just fading echoes, stories to lull you into an even deeper appreciation of your own quiet, clean, and comfortable sanctuary. You can let go of the need to chop wood for the fire, or fight for your share of weevil-infested hardtack, or worry about the contents of the chamber pot being emptied from the window above. No pottage, no salt horse, no desperate foraging awaits you for breakfast, unless you happen to be a particularly adventurous and historically committed chef with a penchant for extreme culinary reenactment. Your eyelids feel exceptionally heavy now, the accumulated weight of centuries of imaginary hardship and historical empathy pressing them gently, irrevocably closed. The images of those past lives, once so vivid and demanding, now soften and blur, becoming like half-forgotten, distant dreams, their sharp edges smoothed by the balm of your present comfort. The myriad discomforts you vicariously experienced, from the mundane to the terrifying, only serve to heighten the profound, almost sacred comfort of your own bed, the gentle, unwavering support of your pillow, the clean, fresh, untainted air in your room. You're safe, you're warm, you're blessedly, wonderfully free from the immediate, pressing, life-or-death concerns that shape the days and nights, the very existence of those who came before. Let the gentle, soothing cadence of this thought guide you further and further into stillness, into profound peace. The long journey is truly over for tonight. Allow yourself to drift, to float, to sink into a truly restful, deeply appreciative and well-deserved slumber, wrapped in the quiet, unassuming and now deeply cherished luxury of the now.